I suspect you have not seen. These are pictures you have not seen before. I had not seen them yesterday. This is the first tower, and a plane going into the first tower. And we were on the air yesterday, Good Morning America, at about 10 minutes to 9 when we got reports that this had happened, and you saw the aftermath of this. But this is an amateur photographer. So much of this is done with handheld video. Just happened to be shooting the tower at the time and actually saw the first plane go into it. You're going to see those pictures again through the morning. But ABC's George Stephanopoulos is here, who has some new details, new information.
That's right, Charlie. The UN is reporting out of Geneva, Switzerland, that they are relocating their temporary workers in Afghanistan. They have about 80 expatriate workers in Afghanistan. They are temporarily moving them out of the country. They're stationed in Kabul, Jalalabad, Mazar, Kandahar, Herat, and Faisalabad. They're all leaving the country, they say, as a precaution against any kind of strike.
And again, we know people have heard this, but in case you're just joining us this morning, of course, it is the Taliban of Afghanistan who have come forward and said they deny that Osama bin Laden has anything to do with, but Osama bin Laden has been harbored in Afghanistan.
And of course, what's important there is last night when President Bush spoke, he said he would draw no distinction between the terrorists themselves and the countries that harbor them, so those places would become vulnerable to attack.
ABC's Claire Shipman is with us down in Washington. And Claire, you were saying last night, I was very interested in it, that you had talked to people who had gotten intelligence briefings, and that those who were giving the briefings, I presume from the CIA, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, were being very frank in using bin Laden's name as the very likely perpetrator.
Well, that's right, Charlie. I was struck by how frank my sources were in telling me that, and I think that the leadership itself, in hearing these briefings from, they said, intelligence officials, were also struck by the fact that they had some very concrete links, they said, that were pushing them to look at bin Laden as the #1 suspect. Again, it's something I think everybody's been talking about, but again, the specificity of some of these links, I think, surprised some of the people who got these briefings on Capitol Hill. The president himself is, of course, going to be heavily involved in this investigation today. I think this is a time of enormous testing and pressure for a new president, and there are going to be a number of tracks we see unfolding at the White House in the coming days. The investigation and getting the government up and running again, but also a president who very much, I'm told, wants to lead the nation in this time of tragedy. He's likely to have a very public meeting with congressional leaders at the White House today to continue that show of unity we saw yesterday. But we're also told, Charlie, that the president is considering a number of options for visiting the sites of these tragedies. The Pentagon would be the most easy for him to visit here in Washington, but also considering a trip to New York, perhaps not today, but in the coming days. There's concern that they might get in the way, of course, as there always is when they make a trip to New York, and certainly in a time like this, it could be a problem. But they've even considered a helicopter trip past what were the World Trade Centers in order for the president to make a gesture at least and show that he's actively involved. We're told he's very eager not to be seen as hiding behind closed doors, and they're concerned that when the numbers of those killed start to come out, that his role is really going to change, and he is going to have to very publicly try to support the nation as president, Charlie.
I'm curious about one thing, Claire, and maybe you've heard something about it, maybe you haven't, but obviously there is, and I was struck by a number of people I talked to yesterday, just friends and people as I called around to find out, are you okay? The level of anger in people, real visceral anger, struck me, and I wonder if there's some sense in Washington of what the ramifications of that are, if there's a sort of desire to get on with this quickly in terms of retaliation.
Well, absolutely. We were told a number of times yesterday by people who spent time very close to the president yesterday that he himself is quite angry. Somebody told me, quote, he was looking for somebody to hit yesterday, and there was a sense that he wants to retaliate quickly. Of course, that desire, a desire many Americans probably share at this point, has to be balanced against the need to be specific in finding out what happened and balanced in that sort of response. But there's no doubt from people who spent time with the president that he himself has a visceral anger and that may be directed toward whatever our response is.
All right, thanks very much, Claire Shipman, who is in Washington. I want to show you one more time the scene here in downtown New York. This is the scene this morning as this rescue effort begins, and just how incredible the feat is that the rescue workers and searchers are going to have to face, the construction people that are down there. I don't know exactly what you call them, but the people who are going to have to sift through this enormous amount of rubble. The collapsed steel in the two towers, standing 5 feet tall now. Just as it collapsed, it's 5 feet, it's 5 stories tall, and we've talked about the amount of soot that is around is also very great. Dr. Tim Johnson is here with us here in our Times Square studios, and Tim, I can only imagine what happened inside there as those buildings came down.
Well, I have to believe, Charlie, that the majority of those who were in the buildings at the time they collapsed suffered enormously severe crush injuries. And it's very unlikely that they would survive that. Some may have been in protected pockets, particularly in bottom areas, sometimes happens. And then their major problem, I suspect, would be burns because of the flames that persisted in that rubble for so many hours. But the crush injuries, given the weight that came down on all of that, have to be just enormous.
Those we've talked to who came down, who actually evacuated, made it down the stairs, made it out, said that by the time they got downstairs, already people were severely burned, wandering around in a daze. Another question about the blood bank this morning. I was told that surgeries have been canceled in New York unless they're a dire necessity to conserve all of the blood, and that the Red Cross is rapidly sending blood toward this city to make sure that there's enough on storage.
Yes, I mean, they will do surgeries if they're life-saving or have any potential to be life-saving, and the response for blood has been enormous, and I honestly don't believe in the long run, if they can be transporting blood in here in efficient ways, that will be the real issue. Burn injuries are an enormously difficult problem for long-term medical care. Fluid loss and infection make it a very chronic injury, and those are the kinds of injuries that consume medical resources very quickly and very enormously.
If there was, one of the saddest quotes I saw yesterday was from a doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital who said, literally, we're getting dozens and dozens of people in here burned head to foot. There was one terribly touching story I read about a man who was coming down the stairway at the World Trade Center, and he passed 4 people, and he couldn't, he went to help them, and he couldn't, and they wouldn't let him touch them because they were so badly burned that they couldn't stand the contact. And I understand that burn patients were flown out to hospitals as far away as Canada, where there are excellent burn units, and down to Nashville, Tennessee, Vanderbilt University apparently that has a good burn unit.
The most important issue is to get them to a burn unit, not just any hospital bed. This requires true expertise. If you have third-degree burns over more than 80% of your body, your chances for survival are minimal, even with the best of modern care. But it certainly is worth a try, and it has to be done by a center that is really expert.
One of the things you said, Tim, is that in the aftermath of these national traumas, that you see these aftershocks around the country, suicide rates.
Yes, there are 3 groups that are really vulnerable in the days after an event like this, even when they're far from the scene, at the other end of the country, for example. One are people who are already having psychological, emotional problems. Something like this, as they watch it over and over again on TV, can tip them over the edge. They need special support, probably increased medication. A second group, believe it or not, are people with coronary artery disease. We know from past traumatic events that the heart attack rate goes up, even nationally, closer to the scene even more, because these people are also marginal, and they need to be in touch with their physicians about increased medication. And finally, I have to mention children who are so vulnerable to the anxiety that they pick up from adults around them and from the television. Their television viewing time, depending on their age, of course, should be restricted, and they need tremendous support to reassure them that they're in a safe environment when they're at home or in some other place with family and friends.
I know, talking to rescue workers who were in Oklahoma City, just the kind of impact it has on them, and it's not impact that necessarily manifests itself in the days that they're there, but they relive it, they go over it, and the residual effects months and even years down the pike are very great.
And now, of course, you're talking about classic post-traumatic stress syndrome. That can absolutely occur up to months later. For the first time, come on, up to months later.
Yeah.
I want to come back, if we can now, to some of these pictures that we have been seeing for the past 24 hours, and they are stunning, the phenomenon in this country of people who have video cameras everywhere, and perhaps the one that made us all just stop and gasp yesterday was the one of the plane going into the second tower, which was the North Tower. It was that United Airlines flight, and
You'll see it come in here
you're
from
going
the
to see it
left-hand
come
side.
in. Take a look up. We're just going to let you watch this for a second.
It slams. When we saw it on the air live yesterday, the second tower was obscured by the first, and we saw that plane come in and then saw the flames shoot out, and you couldn't see it nearly as clearly as you can in that picture taken from the other side of the towers. The plane goes right in. As George Stephanopoulos said to me this morning, it almost looks like a bad special effect in a movie. You can't believe what you're seeing is real. The plane hits the building, the Second World Trade Center tower, broadside, goes right in, and you can see the flame come out the other side. That picture was taken by a young freelance photographer named Evan Fairbanks. And Evan, if I recall your story, you were at Trinity Church down in downtown New York yesterday?
Yeah, we were setting up for a video shoot there to shoot the Archbishop of Wales, and sitting in our studio. And we took a power hit. There was a little flash in the light grid, and about 10 seconds later, people started pouring in, saying things about the Trade Center.
And that would have been about the first building.
That
Now,
was the first
somebody
building.
else had a camera, right? They had a video camera.
Well, basically what happened is there was a little pandemonium and people deciding what to do, whether we should stay, whether we should leave, if the shoot was going to be canceled. And I ran out. Being a photographer, I just had the instinct to leave the building with my still photography gear. And I saw the production manager, this guy David, in the hallway putting a battery on a video camera and a tape in it, and I just instinctively grabbed it like I was going to a fire rescue, and I was grabbing my coat, and I just ran out.
And you were shooting the first tower, which had already been hit by the first flight, the American Flight 11, when United 175, also a 767, came in to the second tower. Did you realize, first of all, was your eye at the viewfinder at that time, or were you just...
My eye was locked on the viewfinder.
And I'm just curious what went through your mind, went through your heart, what came out of your mouth?
There wasn't much that could go through my mind. I just saw a white flash coming out of the left side of the frame, and I recognized it as an airplane, and just thought, why is there an airplane so close? This must be controlled space by now. And by the time I finished that thought, I saw it, the plane disappear into the side of the building.
Shrieking of people all around as they're watching, the horror, the incredulity of people around it. We keep hearing these exclamations, oh God, oh no, oh God, oh no. Do you remember what you said?
I don't have any idea what I said.
Were you scared?
My first thought was to just keep the camera pointed up and hold the shot for the 3 seconds that I'm supposed to hold it for, and then I saw debris raining down and realized I better get out of the way, so I ran around the corner and threw my body and my equipment under the car and just stuck the camera lens out and shot up for another few seconds.
When you're a photographer, you tend to become an extension of your camera rather than a thinking person, I think, because sometimes photographers have always told me sometimes they forget that they're there and they're so focused on the camera. You went, realizing what you had, as I recall, you went to get a copy of that, and then the pictures that you'd made, and then as you came out, just by coincidence of timing, the building was still standing, and you went back to shooting it, and that's when the collapse occurred. You were shooting there at the collapse, right?
Yeah, the Port Authority police that were escorting me with this prize tape said, all right, you want to get one more shot? And I said, yeah, please. And I just was compelled to keep pointing the camera at the sky, at this plume of smoke, because it was so unbelievable. And I just thought, I guess if I keep shooting it, I don't know, maybe it'll go away, or it won't be on the tape, and I just did a tilt down and put some people in the foreground, and suddenly I heard a rumble, and it started coming toward me.
I'm going to try to get the control room to go back and cue that up. It went by once, and I don't. And this is the plane when it came in. But I want to show later on when Evan came back out. There's the plane going in again, and then it was after this that you understandably took off from there, and we saw those pictures of the debris in the streets. I think at one point we even see your shadow here as you're running with the camera. And then it's a little bit later, after this is still going. Yeah, there's your shadow right there with the, you can see the camera in your hand, and these are people, needless to say, with some concern for their own welfare on the streets of New York at that time around the World Trade Center. And then you went in to copy this, as he mentioned, and then came back out, and this is where the collapse came, right?
Right. And I just remember thinking that after a couple of seconds, this is coming at me.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to get out of the way. So I just turned the camera over my shoulder, pointed it up in the air, and just started running. And I have seen footage of volcano ash chasing down a village, and just knew that I was going to be in a really nasty situation. And I just dove under the biggest emergency response vehicle that I could see.
No matter how many times you see it, it just chills you. Evan Fairbanks, thanks very much.
Thank you.
A couple of notes here coming across the wires about flights today. I just want to say, this afternoon, Dulles Airport's going to be opening for people to come in and search for their baggage, and there is a report out now that some airlines are talking about resuming flying today. We've got Southwest Airlines, American West starting to fly again at noon. Delta, Alaska Airlines, Horizon saying they'll resume flights later in the day, and United Airlines, American Airlines have not released statements on their decisions about resumption.
Those, of course, the two airlines that were hit by the hijackers, two planes each from United and American hijacked yesterday, and
Right.
Lisa Stark pointing out that though the announcement yesterday was that all flights in the United States would be suspended through noon today, obviously until they have security measures in place, I doubt the FAA will allow flying to resume, but once those precautions are in place and once they have the security system set, then perhaps we can get America's air system going again.
As we say, details keep emerging, just drop by drop, and Jane's Defense Weekly is always a great source of early information in incidents like this. And we want to go to Paul Beaver, who is with Jane's Defense Weekly, and also we have Vincent Canestraro standing by as a terrorism expert. And if I can start with you, Paul, tell me what you have learned.
Well, it's a very interesting situation that's been developing during the night here in London. And basically, I think that the finger has started now to point towards an Arab or a group that is allied with Osama bin Laden, the America's #1 fugitive. I mean, he's the chief suspect on this now. And it does seem that he and perhaps a group of people allied to him were responsible for this. But if that's so, it meant that they would have been planning this for years. And it's very much a situation that people are concerned that why was there such a lapse in security, not just in the United States, but across the world into the Middle East. Somebody surely should have known this was happening. We knew last week that there was going to be some sort of terrorist activity. We thought it was going to be in the Middle East, and obviously it happened in the United States.
Paul, I'm interested in a couple of things. ABC's John Miller, who interviewed Osama bin Laden once and who has followed this story so closely, said that his pattern has been that he foreshadows, gives some indication of what he's about to do.
Yes, he does. He's got a big ego, and he really likes to be there when it happens, or to see it when it happens. So obviously he would have seen it when it happens, because what he would have done is actually seen it happening live on television, or at least a lot of it live on television, yes. But I think that he normally does, in the way in which a number of terrorists do, actually sort of identifies that there is going to be something happening. And I think that was what the warnings were last week. But there have been warnings through the year. Since the USS Cole was bombed in Aden Harbor, there have been increasing indications here, certainly in Europe and in the Middle East, that Osama bin Laden was going to do something.
I'm interested, you say this would have required planning for years. What makes you think that?
Well, to get simultaneously to hijack 4 airplanes and to fly them into targets of high value, it's not something he thought about last week, or whoever did this thought about last week. You have to get your people into place. You have to make sure that they know what they're doing. You have to make sure they know what they are going to, what their targets are going to be. You have to plan this meticulously. You have to organize forced passports. Now, we understand that the American FBI have identified 5 possible suspects who may well have had passports from the United Arab Emirates. It doesn't mean to say they are Emiratis. It means that they had obtained passports from the United Arab Emirates in the same way as people obtain false passports all over the world. It just would have probably looked good with their complexion. And I think that this is a situation that somebody has thought long and hard about how to do it. The UAE is a strong ally of the United States in the Gulf, so it wouldn't have seemed at all unusual that Emiratis would be traveling domestically in the United States.
Vince Canestraro, if you're there in our Washington bureau, I want to pull you in now.
Yes, Diane.
I want to ask you about this. As we know, Afghanistan has been the country which has harbored Osama bin Laden and harbored his training camps all throughout the country. However, we know we also hear of Syrian involvement. We also hear, well, the Iraqis this morning have put out newspapers saying that this is due punishment for the United States. How much must the United States look at countries other than Afghanistan, and which ones?
Well, I think they have to consider a number of possibilities, but the CIA, I think, has arrived at a preliminary conclusion that it was Osama bin Laden, and that
we can hear you,
that the
Vince.
operation was directed by the bin Laden's organization. But one has to wonder how much support he might have had. For example, in the USS Cole bombing last October, the FBI believes that the bin Laden organization was the perpetrator of that terrorist event, but there was some training and support, particularly by a Hezbollah bomb maker in that operation. So while bin Laden has a far-flung operation, and he does have an inner cadre to conduct very dramatic and sensational kinds of operations, he may have had support from other sources, and that may include a country like Iraq, particularly since Iraq has a motivation to strike back at the United States. But I think this morning all the evidence is pointing towards bin Laden as the author of the operation.
Vince, were you as struck by the president's line as I was in his speech when he said, "We will make no distinction," when he was talking about how the United States would respond? We will make no distinction between those who carried this out and those who harbored them. And obviously my first thought is bin Laden is so well identified as being in Afghanistan, but I wonder if that includes other nations as well.
Charlie, I think the president was reflecting intelligence briefings he had received, and the substance of some of those intelligence briefings was that the bin Laden organization was involved with this operation. I think the intelligence people, as well as federal law enforcement, have already identified some of the characters who may have participated, and at least one of them has been identified as a member of the Al-Qaeda organization itself. So I think all the early information has pointed towards the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. Last night, for example, the FBI spread out across the country in conjunction with INS officials questioning Afghanis in this country who were immigrants, who didn't have full citizenship, may have had green cards, people with a pattern of traveling back and forth to Afghanistan, as part of this focus right now on bin Laden and Afghanistan as the source of these operations. So I think we'll know more definitively within the next couple of days, but I think clearly from the policy point of view, people are focusing on bin Laden and their host, the Taliban.
All right, our thanks to Vince Canestraro and also to Paul Beaver. I want to go back, if we can now, because we've seen pictures coming up of the rescue effort downtown, and bring it back to the human toll. Oh, the humanity. As we have said so many times, 50 to 70,000 people down in this complex, not to mention the firefighters and policemen who went in and who are now missing. As we know, the New York Fire Chief, Pete Gansey, apparently dead. We also have a report now that the 3 top fire department officials may have been among those who died. And one of them was Ray Downey, the chief of special operations, and he led the New York firefighters who went into Oklahoma City to try to undertake the rescue there. As we know, the financial toll is unimaginable, and by that I mean human as well as market toll. We're talking about 51 floors for Morgan Stanley alone in the World Trade Center. We're going to bring in Andy Serwer, who is with ABC and also Fortune magazine editor-at-large. Andy, I can only imagine what it is to be you and start making the list of all the people you know who might be there.
I'm glad you're focusing on the personal side of this, Diane, because for me, the past day has been extremely difficult, as it has been for anyone on Wall Street. Answering the phone and emails is sort of like Russian roulette right now. The joy of finding out that someone didn't go to work yesterday at the World Trade Center, which happened to one of my closest friends, and then people who haven't called home yet, and we can assume perhaps the worst in that case. I also found out apparently a friend of mine had perished, and so this is what it's like, and it's a real human tragedy. And I was trying to comfort my children last night. We had a friend spending the night who was trapped in the city and couldn't get out. So, you know, there are real lives, real people, and it's horrible, and that's what we're all focusing on, and now we're starting to add up the damage.
The stories around New York, everybody you talk to, when I went home last night, as I said, the series of phone calls that you make, and one of my daughter's best friends had a call yesterday from two close friends of hers saying, we're on the 102nd floor of the World Trade Center, there's a fire below us, and we're waiting for rescue. We don't know how serious it is. Do you know anything? And her friend told her what she could, and they haven't been heard from since. And I suspect, since you deal with people in the financial world all the time, and those buildings were so filled with people in the financial world, that story is multiplied many times over in your personal experience.
Yes, and the reports are all over the place. At first, apparently, all the people at Morgan Stanley, 3,500 people or so, were okay. Now we're not sure. Credit Suisse people, still unaccounted for. Cantor Fitzgerald, a big bond firm, unknown. And the reports are just going to be coming in. But, you know, the target was Wall Street. And they tried to destroy Wall Street. And they succeeded to a large degree. I mean, not the whole of Wall Street, but they blew up a large portion of it.
Andy, the planes came in 8:45, 9:03. There are 50,000 people who work in those two twin towers. There's another 20,000, they say, that pass through there to the restaurants, to the shops, to the whatever. It is really a city within itself, those buildings. And we should mention, it's not just those two buildings. There are other buildings there. Number 7 World Trade Center, which was a 47-story building right there in the complex, also collapsed last night about 5 o'clock, brought down not because of any kind of attack, but because the collapse of the towers had done such damage to the building that it went down as well. But do people go to work? What time?
Well, mostly, there's a couple waves. People come in early, people who work on Wall Street. A lot of people come in at 7. There are other people who come in later at 9. A whole lot of people. Charlie, we don't know the answer to exactly how many people are there. We're still trying to figure that out. But there were a lot of people do come in there at 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
A quick question to you about the markets themselves. What's going to happen? We've got, Asia already closed business day in Europe right now. One point I want to make, just a historical point. A month after Pearl Harbor and our entry into World War II, the market was 2% higher than it had been before the attack. So let us remember that. But what do you expect now?
Well, there are going to be some huge short-term implications. Japan was down about 6.6%. The European markets in midday trading right now are actually flat or slightly up. This is the second day for them, though. Remember, they were already feeling the impact of this yesterday. You know, we're going to see the usual things, which is gold is up, oil is up, the dollar is down, stocks are down, bonds are up. In other words, people are looking for safe harbors. We don't know when the U.S. markets are opening. They may open tomorrow. They're closed today, of course. And you've got to expect some short-term shocks. But I think you're right, Diane, that you can't say that this is going to cause a crash. You can't say this is going to tip the economy into a recession. Oftentimes, we seem to bounce back rather quickly. And the good news here, if there is any from a financial standpoint, is that the markets have already taken such a beating over the past year that may prevent a further slide.
I'm going to ask you to stand by because there's a lot of parts of this that we need to discuss. One of the things interesting to me, the Federal Reserve worried if there were any kind of panic, has said that they'll supply extra money to banks and stuff. We'll talk about those kinds of things with Andy in just a moment. But to reset you for just a couple of seconds, and we're going to go and talk in a moment to the Foreign Minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, who is standing by with us. But just to give you one more look at the scene in downtown New York, right now, this morning, the rescue workers are on site. There has been a setting up of equipment, heavy equipment brought in to attack what is such an incredible pile of rubble there in downtown New York. The skyline of New York has been changed. The face of America, to some extent, has been changed by the loss of the World Trade Center building, such a visible symbol of America's financial strength and of the great city of New York. They are simply gone, and these workers are going to have to go through this rubble over the next few days.
And if you're wondering why we don't give you casualty figures, it's because everything is changing hourly. We poll hospitals. That shifts the next time you call. And we're going to have the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, here, and we'll get the firmest possible casualty figures that we can as we go ahead on this morning.
But they've been very properly not giving them, because if you give some sort of a number that you know right now, it's irrelevant, it's meaningless, because you know it's going to go up. And if you give a high estimate, and it's only an estimate, then probably it's so horrible that you just you can't absorb all of that. As the mayor said, it's going to be more than we can bear.
Just a note here, George Stephanopoulos handed it to me. I'm going to let George Stephanopoulos tell us the news.
You know, when the flights resume, we've got some news from the FAA on heightened airport security measures they're going to take when the flights do resume, we hope this afternoon. And they'll basically put back in place the measures we had in place before and during the Gulf War. No checking of bags at the curb, random checks of employees. Only passengers will be allowed through checkpoints. You know, now sometimes every once in a while they let you go to the gate. No more. It is done sometimes at some places now. They will use more canine dogs, and then finally they're going to have far more security officers at the airports. At least that's what they'll do right now.
And again, the reports are coming in that about 3 p.m. flights may resume, but we'll stay on top of that too.
All right, we want to turn to the Foreign Minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, who is joining us this morning. Mr. Peres, can you hear me? It's Charlie Gibson in New York, along with Diane Sawyer and George Stephanopoulos.
I can hear you, and good morning.
We appreciate you joining us. First of all, let me give you a very general question. Your reaction yesterday when you heard what had happened?
Well, the Israelis feel like part of the American family. Your suffering, your pain, your questions are like they would be our own. And it's a terrible thing that has happened. The whole nation is mourning together with you. Then again, I think that America is the only one that can save the world from this terrible terror and from this terrible threat. There's nobody else that can lead us again to become a civilized society and not fall down to the laws and rules of a jungle. I think, by the way, it's possible. What happened to us is, by tradition, we were used to fight enemies. We have had armies against enemies. Now, instead of enemies, we have dangers. Enemies are national, dangers are global. Different arms, different methods, and what is so much important, you have to start to fight them not when they arrive at the airports or embark at the planes, but at the place of their origin, where they are being trained, prepared, and disguised, and it's an entirely different strategy. But I believe that this war too can be won.
You say that and it's Diane Sawyer, Mr. Foreign Minister, and thank you again for joining us.
How are you, Diane?
I'm
Yes.
fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. And all over the country this morning, it is being declared war. I'll hold up the New York Daily News here. It's war. U.S. attacked on the New York Times this morning as well. If it is a war for the United States, what is the kind of retaliation that will work? Again, all of us look at the Middle East and we think how often Israel is retaliated, and yet terrorism goes on.
Well, we have to have a prevention. Israel alone couldn't have deter the war because it's global by nature and we are a small country with limited means to control other places. I think what should be done is to have a scrutiny all over the world and identify those countries or organizations which are hiding, financing, supporting, encouraging terror, and tell them point blank, either you will stop it or you will become a terrorist country organization in the eyes of the world. And I think nobody should be forgiven, no means should be postponed. Like in war, we have to win it with all the legal and reasonable means at our position. The second thing, I think there must be also a spiritual campaign. There must be a call to all the religious leaders, Christians, Muslims, Jewish, to denounce terror. You know, part of those terrorists are getting permission from some clergymen. It's a crime, it's a shame. It goes against the gospel. It goes against all the values which are cherished by all of us. And then we have to look to the financing, to the training. It must be an overall effort with a global dimension, with an American leadership.
Mr. Peres, this is George Stephanopoulos. Good morning. We've seen some reports
Good morning, George.
that say Israel has sealed its land border with Jordan and Egypt. Is that based on any specific threat you've received, and what other kinds of steps has Israel taken this morning to protect its own security?
Well, this morning what happened is there is a town by the name of Jenin that became a center of terror. At least 11 acts of terror were originated from this small place. The army has surrounded the place in order to make sure that no more terrorists or bombs or suicidal bombers will come out of there, and we shall not remain there for a long time.
And you go, Charlie.
Well, Mr. Minister, I'm just curious. So many people in the U.S. government are now pointing to Osama bin Laden as the possible or even likely perpetrator of this, or being largely responsible for it. I'm curious as to what you think we're going to know in a week or a month. What is your theory in all of this, if we find out who is responsible? What do you think we're going to know down the road?
I think you shouldn't look upon it as just a single person or one organization. It's a new dimension. It will be copied. And if you shall not face it determinedly, I mean, you may have it being followed by other countries, by other organizations. The war is today of a global nature, like the economy. We went over from national economy to global economies. Now we're going over from national enemies to global dangers. It cannot be stopped at any point, because even it's bin Laden, some people may try to copy him. And there must be a barrier, there must be a countermeasure, it must be clear that nobody will escape the verdict of this terrible act.
And a quick question to you about a meeting, Mr. Foreign Minister. I know you've been working and talking about meetings with Arafat. Any meetings planned? Yasser Arafat, head of the Palestinians, the PLO.
We were in touch with Arafat, and we told him, look, tonight may be your night. You have to decide to which camp do you belong. To the camp that uses or supports or guides terror, or the camp that stands against it. In a way, if I may say so, it's like giving up smoking. Tonight, you can decide to give up smoking or to go up and burn yourself in the smoke. Arafat must take today a clear decision. The time of twilight, of hesitation, of double language is over. And I think it's a good chance for him too. If we will stop it, we can easily return to the table of negotiations, because we want to live in peace with the Palestinians.
You're saying you contacted him after this and said to him, tonight is your night, and what did he say?
Well, I didn't say that I have contacted him. I said the message was delivered to him. He stood up against terror, but he must give orders. It's not enough to publish a declaration, and we know the sorts of orders which are being issued. If he will give out clear orders, if he will call his own troops, his own policemen, to fight terror, it will be one destiny of the Palestinians. If we will continue to escape the choice, it will be another sort of relationship.
Mr. Peres, do you have any evidence of any connection between the forces connected to Mr. Arafat and those connected to Osama bin Laden?
I would be very careful not to point out a finger without very careful information, and I am not ready to guess or blame anybody.
All right, Shimon Peres, Foreign Minister of Israel, we very much appreciate your being with us this morning. It was good to talk to you. I thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. We want to just reset one more time to bring you up to date, because people are going to be joining us through the morning. Many people waking up on the East Coast. If you're with us on the West, then I suspect you've been up most of the night, and indeed, this is a time really when it's awfully difficult to pull yourself away from the television set, because we're obviously all, and Diane and I and George and John Miller, who are all here, we all feel the same way. We're waiting for new nuggets of information, just new things that we know, and it all happens very slowly. But just to reset with you, this has been a night of preparing for a search through a massive amount of rubble, and we want to show you the pictures from downtown New York again, outside the World Trade Center building, where basically you now have a 5-story tall mass of rubble that searchers are going to have to go through, and it's going to be a long, long process. We've talked a lot about the soot that is all around. You walk through it, you don't know what you're walking on or what you're walking over. It really is a terribly depressing thing for those who are in the area and who are having to do the searching. And Don Daler is down there to report on what's been going on. Don, you've been there through the night, I know. Can you hear me?
Charlie, I'm down here
Go ahead, Don.
about 4 blocks away, and there is a hole in the sky behind me. There used to be 2 gigantic buildings right where you can see a little bit of the dawn starting to rise over there. A little while ago, we walked through the wreckage, and what we saw was a lot of workers on the outskirts of the destruction area trying to use gigantic blowtorches, well, just regular blowtorches, moving gigantic pieces of metal, these steel girders that were obviously support beams for the building that had fallen over. They were working on the outer side of the wreckage, moving their way in. Meanwhile, we could see some firemen gingerly making their way, crawling over the actual wreckage field itself. They would stop, they'd crouch down, they'd listen for a long time, then they would move along. We did not see any bodies being pulled out or any injured people at that point. Directly across Church Street, from where the World Trade Center once stood, we could see the Millennium Hilton. It looked like it had chunks taken out of it, as if obviously parts of the World Trade Center had smashed into that building as well. As we made our way further north, you could see more and more firemen working through the rubble of the North World Trade Center building. And there seemed to be a lot more activity on that side. One thing I wanted to report, a high-ranking New York PD officer told us that we should expect that there would be what's called an operational control zone in southern Manhattan. It could go as far north as 14th Street, which would mean only emergency personnel and National Guard would be allowed here for perhaps as much as a week, according to this New York police officer.
Yes, I know, Don, that basically New York today is shut off south of 14th Street, but if it extended that long, and unless you know New York City, people from outside the city, unless you know New York, you must realize that south of 14th Street is an enormous area. I mean, it goes down into Greenwich Village and down into the Wall Street area, and Soho is all down there, and Tribeca. That's an enormous amount of New York to be simply closed down for that long period of time.
It is, and the reason, according to the police officer, is because they are concerned not only about the structural damage of buildings around this area and whether they are still safe. They're also concerned about gas mains. In fact, we can see Con Edison workers right behind this truck right here checking different gas lines that go all the way up and down Manhattan. So part of the concern is that there might be ruptures caused by this event that they're trying to track down.
And if that proves to be the case, of course, it would mean that that U.S. markets, because the stock market is down there, the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange, I believe, are both down there. NASDAQ is uptown. But those exchanges and so many of the people, actually, the brokers who trade in NASDAQ are all down there. That would mean really that the American financial markets would be shut down if that proves to be the case, that they keep downtown New York closed off for at least a week.
Possibly.
Up to a week.
Charlie, but
yes, I'm sorry, Don. Go ahead.
Keep in mind, that's okay, but keep in mind one thing. The way that the stock exchange is computerized now in recent history, it does not necessarily mean that it will be closed down as long as this area. They might be able to reroute the services and keep the market going.
All right. Well, we'll ask Andy Sherwer about that in a few moments. Thanks very much, Don Daly.
And one other thing, I just want to remind people again that we have had reports, overnight that 2 people were rescued. We are not trying to get into the business right now of giving you numbers or trying to confirm any specifics about this, but we will be talking with the mayor soon so that we'll know a lot more about exactly what may have been identified, about those reports of 911 calls amid the wreckage, and also who may or may not have been rescued overnight, coming up soon.
ABC's John Miller is here. John, who was himself once an employee of the New York Police Department and who has good police sources and also has very good sources in the international community about what take place. New details? New news?
Yeah, Diane just touched on that. Last night, for a long time, I monitored over the police radio system the hunt for 2, what they identified as Port Authority police officers who were trapped in the rubble. And then, after a long time, there was word that they were freed from the rubble, which was good news. This morning's New York Times adds some detail to that, reporting that one of them, at least, was freed at a terrible price. They said the rescuers who were digging him out had to amputate his leg, which was stuck under things that they could not move because of the weight. It was a very difficult night for rescues. Throughout the night, gas-fed fires at the scene from those gas mains hampered their ability to get into most of the rubble and wreckage. That was a small victory, rescuing those 2. And of course, we heard the traffic regarding the people calling from cell phones into Pennsylvania, and they literally took detailed notes from those phone calls about exactly where they said they were, and developed really a written package that they brought to the rescue workers after debriefing the 911 operators and the family, and said, this is all we have, and worked that through the night. And maybe the mayor can fill us in. We have no word on whether that was successful.
All right, we want to go to Cynthia McFadden, who's at St. Vincent's Hospital. It's one of the frontline hospitals, not so close. I mean, it's still blocks and blocks away from the area, but because those in the area were overwhelmed, St. Vincent's has really become an important area, an important receiving area for those who have come out. Cynthia, what are you hearing this morning?
Well, Diane, as you can see, the medical team here is assembled and waiting to treat patients, but it has been the excavation equipment that's been doing most of the work, and those still at the site, not the medical personnel. I can tell you that St. Vincent's, which has seen the bulk of the patients in this disaster, 362 is the number that the hospital confirms this morning. Just moments ago, another firefighter was brought in. He was wearing a neck brace. He had been one of the early rescuers, we understand. That is primarily who has been brought here, rescuers, police, fire, other emergency personnel for treatment. That is, of course, the very bad news. We also were over at Chelsea Piers, which is the source of the triage, where all the most serious people were to be taken. Chelsea Piers is empty. They are standing with 50 operating rooms empty. It means they can't get to the victims.
We've talked to Cynthia a lot about casualty numbers, and needless to say, it's going to be a long time before we have a fix on the number of dead. But some of the really chilling details that we know, the fire department officials in New York talk about the fact that there are 300 New York firefighters missing, including some of the highest-ranking New York firefighters that there are. Those were the first wave that went into the first tower, and when it collapsed, there were an enormous number of firefighters inside. 300 firefighters. When you think about that number, it's chilling. 78 members of the New York Police Department missing. Again, those were the first waves that went in that were involved in the evacuation of the first twin tower that came down about an hour after the plane hit it. And they were still involved in the evacuation. They were still in the building, many of them, and now they have not been heard from. The tolls on the plane, we know 266 Americans, crew, flight attendants, and passengers, 266 on the 4 planes that were hijacked, all dead. And then, as the mayor said, it's going to be a number that most of us can't bear when we find out eventually how many died in the collapse of those buildings.
We want to go to ABC's Lisa Stark once again because she's monitoring everything that comes, John McWethy at the Pentagon. And we'll find out what the latest he has right now about the situation there and what he has learned about anything to do with the flights. John.
The military is continuing what they call combat air patrol around Washington and New York. What that means is that there are AWACS planes up. These are airborne early warning systems that are backing up what the FAA is seeing. This is a combat system. If aircraft that happen to be moving through this area are operating in any erratic way, they would be tracking that. There are also combat aircraft up and some on alert at various Air Force bases in the region. So the sense that this may not entirely be over is continuing, although authorities doubt that there's going to be another blow. Also, in the U.S. and in the Persian Gulf, we are being told from Pentagon sources that various exercises have been canceled. In the Persian Gulf, canceled probably because forces want to be on the ready should they be ordered to do anything in that region. In the U.S., because it has become so difficult to move around in various parts of the United States, and I think the military commanders that have canceled these exercises are trying not to further irritate a transportation system that is already stressed. Diane?
All right, thanks to you, John McWethy. Now we'll go to Lisa Stark. Want to learn anything new she has about the planes, and we talked to you earlier about that Christian Science Monitor report about the air traffic controllers being able to hear the hijackers talking in English. Anything new about this?
I don't have anything new on that, Diane. As you reported, the Christian Science Monitor is saying on that one American Airlines flight, Flight 11, I believe, the first one into the World Trade Tower, that the pilot was able to open his microphone, in a sense, and allow air traffic controllers to hear what was going on in the cockpit, to hear the hijackers talking to the pilots, as you said, in good English, telling him if he cooperated, no one would be hurt. I do not have a confirmation that that is so, but it would not surprise me at this point that the pilot would try to get a message any way he could to air traffic controllers. That, again, was the first plane that hit the World Trade Tower. We know 266 people on board all of those planes.
Lisa?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to talk a little bit about the resumption of flights today, but if you have something else. Well, the FAA has indicated that it will make some announcement shortly after 7 a.m. Eastern Time about how things will proceed today. They indicated in the wee hours of the morning that they hoped to get flights back up and running around noon. As you have indicated, a number of airlines have said today that that's when they hope to begin flying again. But the FAA and the airlines have also made it very clear that they will not start flights again until all the security measures they feel are in place need to be in place. And we can talk about some of the security measures that we believe will be put in place today. Certainly you will see much more visible law enforcement and possibly even some military personnel at some of the key airports, particularly in the New York and the D.C. area. They hope to do a security sweep of planes and airports before they're back in the air. The planes are back in the air. You will likely be stopped at random and asked for your identification in the airport terminal. They'll do random ID checks. That's not just ID checks, by the way, of passengers, but also of those who work in the airport. They are going to be subject to these random ID checks as well. No curbside check-in, as you said. No one but passengers beyond the security checkpoints. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed to go down to the gates. As we mentioned earlier, they are changing their rule about bringing knives on board airplanes. It may surprise folks to know, but under current regulations, you can bring a knife on board an airplane if it has a blade less than 4 inches, for example, a pocket knife. As of today, there will be no knives of any kind allowed to be brought on board an aircraft. Also, we may see some ramping up of the Sky Marshal program. Now, that would not be visible to passengers. Sky Marshals do ride on airplanes now, but we don't know how many, we don't know how frequently they do it, but we understand there may be a ramping up of that program as well.
Lisa, there's one thing I want to touch on very quickly, which is a story that I'm sort of hung up on, and maybe we can get you to comment on it through the morning, but I'll touch on it very quickly here. The two planes that took off from Boston, American Flight 11 and United Flight 175. They took off from Boston, headed for the West Coast. They tend, in that flight pattern, actually to turn slightly to the north as they go across Massachusetts. Those two planes took a precipitous turn to the left and headed down to New York. And it was about 20 minutes between the time they made that turn and the two planes, respectively 18 minutes apart, plowed into the World Trade Center towers. And I'm just curious about the fact that the air traffic controllers had to know for 15, 20, 25 minutes that they had two rogue aircraft headed toward New York.
Well, I did speak with a number of controllers yesterday. As you might imagine, they are being very mum. They have been informed by the FBI not to say anything, and in fact, they're being very quiet about what they know and what they saw. Clearly, these planes deviated from their flight paths, and I do know that from talking to the controllers in the New York area that at least by the time the second plane had deviated, they had a very clear understanding of what was going on. And they could only watch, they told me, in horror and in helplessness at the blip on the screen as it approached Manhattan. Obviously, there was nothing they could do. They had a very clear idea in their minds at that point what was likely to happen. So clearly they knew something was wrong up there. The planes were not in their normal pattern. It would be typical that they would try to contact the pilots. No doubt they did that to say, hey, where are you going? You're not where you're supposed to be. We don't know, of course, if they got any response back from the planes at that time. And as we have reported, it's unclear whether the pilots sent that squawk, that certain code that would let the air traffic controllers know that the planes were being hijacked. There's some early indications that warning signal, if you were, was not sent. Right. So we don't know if that signal was sent to controllers or not.
Well, it's something to explore in coming days, but after one plane, the first plane hit the first Trade Center tower at 8:45. The second one came in at 9:03. That's an 18-minute difference, and for controllers sitting there watching that second plane heading to New York for 18 minutes, I just wonder why some sort of a warning wasn't issued since the second tower was there. But as I say, those are questions that are to be answered down the pike, and I don't mean to put them to you today.
No, well, I mean, I can tell you, I don't know if there were attempts to make warnings. I know that certainly will be a question that will come up. I do know that the controllers that I've spoken to have told me that there was simply just a helpless feeling that they just watched this blip and they just could not do anything about it. People apparently in other parts of the air traffic control center, the building, came rushing up to look at the scopes. Word was spreading that something was going on. No one knew what to do, and they came rushing up to see what was going on as this was unfolding.
All right, thanks very much, Lisa Stark.
We're going to go to St. Vincent's Hospital now. They have a press conference underway. It's Mark Ackerman speaking. As we say, this is a hospital at the very center of the attempt to save people.
Admitted to St. Vincent's, Manhattan. 4 of those individuals have died. 58 of the individuals who have come to St. Vincent are paramedics, firefighters, or police officers. We have 6 other hospitals in our system in Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. Those hospitals received 42 additional patients, including 20 who were brought by barge over to St. Vincent, Staten Island. One of those individuals died at St. Vincent, Staten Island. Our paramedics were at the scene throughout the day yesterday. As you saw and continue to see, we are ready for what we hope will be additional survivors today. We are the closest trauma center, and thus if there are any miraculous recoveries from the wreckage, they will most likely be brought here. I'm going to ask Dr. Westphal to talk to you a bit about our paramedics and the work that they did, our ambulances, and the work that's happened in the trauma center, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Westphal, Associate Director of the Department of Emergency Medicine. Mr. Ackerman has mentioned the number of patients that we've had, the conditions, and the 4 deaths in Manhattan here. Our paramedics have had about 7 crews since 8 a.m. yesterday morning that have assisted Fidney EMS in obviously this massive undertaking of responding to critical trauma emergencies downtown. All of our crews have been able to participate and treat patients and move patients, and fortunately have not been injured or been critically injured themselves. We have in the emergency department right now all through the night a triple staff of nurses, physicians, physician assistants, and technical staff. The administrative senior management has been up almost all of them throughout the night, and we've been prepared and are awaiting victims from the site as well. We are, as I think Mayor Giuliani has said over and over.
So again, that's at St. Vincent's Hospital, and as they say, they're the first trauma center as you're heading uptown, major trauma center. They said overall 361 people had been received. I think they had been treating about 90 of them. They said 58 were paramedics, and I think he believed that 4 of those received there had died at
And that
St.
hospital,
Vincent.
that trauma center, got some of the worst burn victims that came out of the Trade Center towers yesterday.
We're going to welcome now the former ambassador to the United Nations, Richard Holbrooke, who is joining us this morning. And I was just asking you a bit ago, if you've called anybody, if you've talked to anybody, can you add anything to our sense of who is behind that this morning?
Who's behind this horror? No, I can't add anything. I assume, as everyone does, that it's connected to Osama bin Laden, but that's for the authorities to figure out. What I do want to underscore is the key sentence in President Bush's speech last night, that the United States will make no difference between those who perpetrated this act and those who condoned it or sheltered the people. This is the beginning of a new rules for a new kind of war, because it is absolutely clear, at least to me, and I hope to everyone, that whoever did it, the people who sheltered those groups are equally complicitous. If it's, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that's where the speculation is this morning, and let's say for a minute, we don't have proof, but let's say it was Osama bin Laden, then the Taliban has to understand that they and the people in control in Afghanistan are equally responsible and will be so treated. And this has got to be part of something that the United States leads, not unilaterally, but as an international coalition, which involves not only our European allies, but Russia, China, and this is going to be the really tough thing, the moderate Arab states, because the bulk of the Muslim world does not support this kind of thing, but as long as they can hide within moderate Arab societies, this will go on.
But, Mr. Ambassador, it's not necessarily confined to one state that may have harbored bin Laden's people.
That's right.
And as the foreign minister of Israel, Mr. Perez, who was with us a few moments ago, pointed out that this is multi-headed and that it could have been, that people involved in this effort could have been harbored by a number of nations.
And if the analogy you've made and everyone has made is to Pearl Harbor, and so the differences are equally critical. I think Perez is right, and therefore the United States is going to have to go across the board to look for the people who did it. But the point here, Charlie, is that they are not governments. They are what in the diplomatic jargon are called non-state actors. Non-state actors are hiding within regimes like the Taliban and Iraq, and the United States is going to have to after identifying them, take action. And those actions should include, and this is the key point, and this is what President Bush correctly said last night, this should include anyone who shelters them as co-equally responsible for this horrible act.
But when you're talking about taking actions, we've seen strategic strikes before on Iraq, retaliatory strikes. What are you talking about when suddenly we say this is war? What are we talking about?
Well, I don't know what actions are necessary because, like everyone else, I don't know exactly how this was done.
But what would be effective?
It depends, Diane, who and where it came from. But if it's Osama bin Laden, the Taliban have gotten off very lightly so far for letting him operate out of their country.
But essentially what
Just giving that as an example. And there was an attempt 2 or 3 years ago to go after Osama bin Laden by air. They didn't get him. There's going to have to be more of that, and it's going to need international support, and the Taliban or whoever else is sheltering them, and I take your point, Charlie, all have to be held equally responsible.
But Diane makes the point that we have been so ineffective in bombing attacks, both on Iraq and the retaliatory attacks you're talking about against Afghanistan, though those were targeted specifically to try to get Osama bin Laden. So, if you have to move beyond airstrikes, what options are you talking about?
First, you have to figure out what the issues are. And I think here it's important to make a point to the American public. Even in a clear-cut case of aggression, such as the one in which Iraq invaded Kuwait 10 years ago last month, it took the senior Bush administration 7 months from the invasion to the military action. I don't think the American public should expect in anything significant. There may be a symbolic airstrike somewhere along the way, but I think this is going to be a sustained effort, and I think the American public should understand, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the administration here, Charlie, I'm just making an instinctive reaction. General Clark and I did another program last night together, and General Clark made the point, and I agree with him, that it's going to be a long, sustained effort of identification, the right plans, and the right reaction. And we're in for a long and different kind of situation now. While we tighten our security at home, and your questions about the 18-minute gap only highlight the fact that there was a security failure, a massive one. While we deal with that problem, we're going to have to deal with the fact that this is a new and different kind of attack, and it's going to take a while. And we will all support, as Americans, the Bush administration while they come up with the plans. And what it is, I don't know. And believe me, they don't know this morning either. They're just starting to deal with this.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, thanks so much for coming in this morning, because we're going to go now to Terry Moran, who is at the White House, and see what he's learned about how they're dealing with it this morning.
Well, Diane, obviously this president and his administration have an enormous task before them today and in the weeks and months ahead. It is investigatory, it is military, and it is political. I can tell you that officials have been working through the night, national security officials, amassing information, beginning the preparation to decide what the nature of the response, where that response should be targeted, the issues that Mr. Holbrooke was just talking about right now. Last night, before retiring to the residence for the evening, the president had a National Security Council meeting. Afterwards, I bumped into Dr. Condoleezza Rice, who's the head of the National Security Council. And I will say this, everybody is focusing on what the president said last night, and quite properly so, that there will be no distinction made between the terrorists and those who harbored them. And people are reading understandably into that, that if nation states are found to have harbored and protected the terrorists, this is an indication that the U.S. will respond against the nation state. However, when I asked Dr. Rice if this was an act of war perpetrated on the United States yesterday, she very carefully avoided that word. They are not ready to go there yet. And so you see the kinds of decisions that they have ahead of them in the days ahead.
Terry, I think it's understandable that people, we were talking earlier about the fact people are angry, and they're angry right now. And there is a desire for something to be done. You want to answer back when you are struck. And yet Dick Holbrooke was just talking about the fact that this could take some considerable period of time. I wonder if there's any consideration given or thought, or if you've heard anything about the fact that they do have a public who is riled up, in effect, and that there could indeed be a need for a lot of time before we identify who did this and how we retaliate.
Absolutely, Charlie, and that's a great point. One of the things administration officials have said to us is that the president wants to communicate that he understands those quite natural, quite justified feelings of anger and rage, but he wants to reassure the public and try to get the country back to some sense of normalcy, if possible. But I will say this is one of those moments where the president is going to have some difficulty controlling the foreign policy of the United States. There will certainly be today in Congress and in the days ahead a rallying behind the president, and yet that whirlwind of emotion that you're talking about that is undoubtedly going to cascade through the country is going to be very difficult for the president to ride and control as they try to figure out what the response should be.
And Terry, we've got a footnote from George Stephanopoulos.
Terry, I just received a phone call from a White House official saying that the joint congressional leadership meeting will be at 11:30 this morning, they hope, in the cabinet room. Are they giving out any other details of possible meetings by the president or public statements today?
They are. Now, what they have said is that they have cleared what was to be his schedule today, but what they want is to get back to some of those more mundane presidential events as soon as possible. Obviously, today that will not be possible. He'll be meeting with the congressional leadership. He'll be meeting with national security advisors. And as of right now, we have no word on what, if anything, he will say to the country. But they do feel the pressure, the need that the country has to hear from the president as he spoke last night. And we expect to hear from him today as well.
Also, Terry, Claire Shipman a little while ago had raised the possibility that he might visit the two sites, go to the Pentagon and perhaps even come to New York in coming days.
I had heard discussion of that as well. My source had said that it is the nature of this president not to want to get in the way, not to want to make a spectacle of his visit. He certainly naturally, as a leader and as a human being, wants to go to these places to comfort the afflicted there, and yet he realizes what a gigantic spectacle it is when the president travels anywhere. You'll recall that when the crew of the EP-3 spy plane or surveillance plane that was brought down in China returned to the United States, the president very ostentatiously did not show up at their return to the United States because of that kind of concern. But those discussions are ongoing, and we do expect him at some point to make a visit to these sites.
Okay, Terry, thanks to you, and we'll check back in with you, of course, throughout the morning. A note here on the Associated Press that the aircraft carrier USS George Washington is now in position off the coast of New York City, and that other Atlantic Fleet ships have been directed to provide defense and medical support both for New York and for Washington, D.C. But a lot of people were talking all day long yesterday about where is the president? Where is the president? We knew that Vice President Cheney, Condoleezza Rice were in the White House. But the president started out, as we know, at an education event. And
he was down in Florida yesterday when this occurred, got word of it very quickly, and then was taken from Florida, took off, and of course the first thought is he's returning to Washington. Well, he wasn't returning to Washington. He went to Louisiana. The Secret Service was concerned about bringing him back to Washington. I heard yesterday that they were very concerned about that fourth plane that went down in Pennsylvania, that it may have been headed for Washington, perhaps targeting either Camp David or the White House. Who knew? They were worried about the security of the president, so they didn't bring him back, took him to Louisiana. Next, he went to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, had a meeting there with top security officials by teleconference, and then came back later in the day to Washington. It was a long, involved trip that brought him back. Ann Compton, ABC's Ann Compton, our old friend, was on Air Force One throughout that. And Annie, give me some sense of the day.
Well, Charlie, we've always known that there's a doomsday scenario to keep the president safe and keep him in command of the government at a time of absolute dire crisis. And let me show you that yesterday, the whole day started in a place of incredible, simple innocence. In a second-grade classroom in Florida, as squirming children showed off their reading skills, President Bush heard in a whisper the words that would change America dramatically. His chief of staff told him a second plane had crashed into the World Trade Centers. The president's face showed instantly he knew this was no accident.
May God bless the victims, their families, and America.
A day-long scramble began as fear mounted for the president's safety. The Pentagon was attacked. The U.S. government was now a target. We could tell we were not flying back to Washington. We headed west. Our arrival at a Louisiana base to refuel was supposed to be secret, but Air Force One is a difficult plane to hide. The president made a short statement to our camera.
Make no mistake. We will show the world that we will pass this test.
Presidents are supposed to comfort the grieving and give hope to those who survive. Back in the air to another mystery destination. Within hours, we found ourselves at the Strategic Command Headquarters in Nebraska. The president disappeared into an underground bunker for a teleconference with the White House. The president began to insist his place was back in Washington. He's the commander-in-chief. He made the ultimate decision to return home. And we noticed the fighter escorts at our wingtips stayed close.
It was one of those days in which the president almost seemed hunted, didn't have a safe place to hide. And it was revealing, of course, this is the first real challenge of this nature this president has faced. Charlie?
Yeah, I was so curious, Annie, yesterday as you were getting into the plane and talking to the newsroom, and people were saying, where are you going, where are you going? And you said, I don't know.
That was true. Each leg, especially as we left Florida, the president had said to these children, I need to go back to Washington. But we looked at the landscape underneath us. We could tell by the direction of the sun that we were nowhere near the Atlantic coast. What's more, we were very, very high. This was the hour in which planes were being cleared from the air and were being forced to land down. We were up over 40,000 feet. We couldn't see the jet fighter escorts. And when we landed at the first stop, we had even been told not to use our cell phones because it would be so easy to locate us by those cell phone signals. Only on that last leg back to Washington were we told the president is going back to the White House. And we're told that he was the commander-in-chief and he made that decision.
And of course, you're always looking to read tea leaves. Your sense of the president's demeanor yesterday?
We saw him briefly on the plane late in the day, and he seemed to me a man who had been stretched thin by what he had been, really walking through a disaster that no one knew where it was leading. And I think when we saw him up close making that statement at the first base, his eyes were somewhat red. He was showing the signs of strain that only a president must be able to feel when he sees his own citizens as the vulnerable targets, and he unable to return to the White House, at least initially.
All right. Ann Compton, thanks very much.
And now I want to just check inside. Do we have the Defense Secretary? Because we're hoping to be able to speak with him.
Former Defense Secretary Bill Cohen, William Cohen, joining us from Washington. Mr. Secretary, good morning.
Good morning.
Your sense overall of where we're going to be in the next days, weeks, what's going on now within the military establishment?
I think first that the President and his national security team are going to gather all the information that's available, analyze it, and then make a very cold, calculating decision in terms of what kind of response and where. I think that some measure of time needs to pass until they can gather all this information, but not too much, because if too much time elapses before any kind of response is initiated, the international pressure at that point for action will dissipate somewhat, and then there'll be calls for the United States not to take any kind of action. So there's a timeline that it's at work here, but I think that for the next day or a few days, this is the kind of analysis that will be made.
I know that former defense secretaries are also deeply in touch with people, and I just wonder, how certain are you hearing Osama bin Laden is it, and Afghanistan is the target?
Well, the footprints of guilt, so to speak, would tend to lead to Osama bin Laden and his supporters. We don't have that information yet that would be conclusive, but I think the probabilities are there. The President will have to analyze and make a judgment in terms of, if this is the case, whether action should be taken against those who he said would be held responsible, namely those who are harboring him. And Afghanistan is the place where he has been known to be residing from location to location given a period of time, but Afghanistan would be a logical place to look for him and his supporters.
A question that we explored with former UN Ambassador Holbrooke, who was here a few moments ago. We have had retaliatory strikes against Afghanistan. We tried to take out Osama bin Laden. We weren't able to do it. We've had retaliatory airstrikes at times against positions in Iraq. What are the options? I mean, that's not going to be enough, is it? Where
No.
do you begin to think about after that?
Well, first of all, it should not only be a military option that's being considered. I think we have to look at the full panoply of options available, including diplomatic and economic. Namely, we need to ostracize those countries who, in fact, either support terrorism or harbor terrorists. So you need to have international, and I think Dick Holbrooke made this point, we need to have multilateral support for actions that we take that go beyond the military itself. This is not going to be a one-strike response. We are in a different kind of war now. We are in a war of terrorism, and they have launched this war against us on our homeland, and this is not simply one strike. We have to now be concerned about others that will follow. One of the things that we have been most concerned about is that we are likely to see multiple acts of terrorism on American soil, and with these terrorists using weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological or potentially even nuclear. So this is not something that's going to be dealt with a single response, military response by the United States. This has to be a coordinated international response to root out terrorists and those who support them.
Mr. Secretary, I just very quickly, I'm curious about one thing. The World Trade Centers have always, it seems to me, been a vulnerable target. But I must say, having lived many years in Washington, I never thought I would see the pictures I'm looking at right now of the Pentagon, which always seemed to me the rock of solidity sitting on the shores of the Potomac River. You were in that building, headed that building for a number of years. I know you go through security plans, but that's your building, and I can't imagine how you feel.
I worried virtually every day that something like this might happen. As I used to preside over some of the receptions and parade ground ceremonies that we had, each time I walked out on that ground or walked out from my office at the Pentagon, I worried about all of those aircraft flying directly overhead. I worried about a plane going out of control, losing its altitude and crashing in the Pentagon. I worried about a terrorist taking control of a plane and crashing in the Pentagon. It's not something that was beyond the realm of imagination. So we did worry about it, but by virtue of our proximity to the airport and by virtue of the fact that we have open and free skies, it's virtually impossible to provide protection against the kind of attack that we saw.
All right, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you being with us this morning. Thanks very much. It is an obscenity looking at that building. It is simply an obscenity.
I think a lot of people were stunned to learn that there's not a no-fly zone over the Pentagon, and hasn't been for the reasons that the former secretary said.
You look down on it from the airliners as you're coming into the airport. There you are, right over the Pentagon.
I want to go to George Stephanopoulos, because again, we can all feel the rage. We can all say, let's do something, let's attack. But I keep hearing the government officials say, it's an international response. It's got to be international. Is that really all we're talking about in terms of a major incremental difference in response? Maybe we'll have retaliatory attacks, but the key is it's got to be international this time?
For any long-term strategy to succeed, and you heard Ambassador Holbrooke talk about the importance of the moderate Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, and this is so difficult to get, however. If you went along with Secretary Cohen and had economic sanctions, say, beyond what we already have against Iraq and Afghanistan, are Egypt and Jordan going to go along with those kind of sanctions when they're facing pressure from their neighbors? And what kind of pressure will that put them under? Because their populations are right now very militant and quite anti-American. This will put them under tremendous pressure. So we're really caught in a dilemma. We need the moderate Arab states to go forward to have credibility in the region, but if they go forward with us, they may be in trouble themselves.
He thinks logically about the international component in all this and how you handle the states, but the political component, this country is miffed. And as we use a stronger word, it's angry.
And the President of the United States will not wait for the United Nations or some kind of international coalition for an initial strike. I think both officials, though, were talking about how to maintain a long-term policy, but you're exactly right. And no, I don't think a president at this point could get away with that.
If you went to the country and said, we're going to impose stiffer economic sanctions and maybe there'll be a retaliatory bomb attack, this country is going to be
up in arms.
Up in arms. This country is mad.
And someone we have not heard from on this front, former President Bill Clinton, who is in Australia. And earlier this morning, he spoke, and here's what he had to say.
Well, first of all, I spent last night glued to the television here, grieving like most Americans because of the colossal loss of life in New York and at the Pentagon. People in New York, in places I know well, and the people in the Pentagon who served this country loyally, including during the 8 years I was president. So it's a heartbreaking thing. I think it's important that we concentrate now on all those rescue operations and that Americans support them in whatever way we can. I think we have to support the reconstruction, and I believe the American people will support doing whatever's necessary to bring back New York and of course, the Pentagon. And finally, I thought the President made a fine address to the country. I agree with what he said. And I think it's absolutely imperative that the American people demonstrate to the whole world our unity. He'll have some challenging decisions to make. They're working hard to find out what the facts are. And I think now is the time for all of us just to join together and say that a lot of innocent people were killed by an evil force. And we're going to stand together against it until justice is done and accountability is had, until we can make the world a safer place for other decent people. So I'm, for one, determined to do whatever I can to be supportive, and I think all Americans feel that way.
Those are the comments of the president, the former president, in Sydney, Australia, where he got the news of what had happened and obviously saw the television reports. George, he must feel tremendous frustration if, and the signs point to Osama bin Laden, if it is indeed bin Laden who is heavily involved in this. It was the president who tried to take out bin Laden in 1998, was it?
Back in August 1998, during the impeachment scandal. Remember, he tried to take out two targets, one in Sudan and one in Afghanistan, and it turned out that the attack on the chemical plant in Sudan turned out to be a mistake, and the attack against bin Laden in Afghanistan turned out to be completely ineffective. It's very hard to find him.
And I suppose we owe Mr. bin Laden at least saying that the Taliban came forward to say that he says he didn't do it. He says, not me, but thank Allah for what happened. And by the way, John Miller said to me earlier, this is the way he likes to operate, that he likes to send signals ahead of time. Something's coming, and when something happens, say, but of course, I didn't do it.
And the Taliban saying that he didn't have the resources to do it, and these took considerable resources. We will find out, obviously, in coming days. Dr. Tim Johnson is here. I'm sorry, you started to say something.
No, I was just going to do the same thing.
Dr. Tim Johnson is here, and we have been seeing the pictures, and perhaps can see them again, of what's going on in downtown New York as rescue workers or searchers are on the scene of the incredible pile of rubble that is the 2 World Trade Center towers and number 7 World Trade Center that is right next door. And we've had some reports from the hospitals of what kind of cases they're getting in, the numbers. There are semi-tractor trailers there, horribly, simply to take away the dead.
I think all of the hints are pointing in the direction of this not being a medical story for survivals, but a mortuary story for the retrieval and identification of the dead. And that means we have to turn our attention to family and friends, and for that matter, all of us, as we try to digest this terrible horror and its outcome. I pointed out earlier 3 groups particularly vulnerable in those circles. Number 1, people with already existing emotional disorders. They get very quickly tipped over the edge. Suicide rates go up. People with heart disease, the heart attack rates go up. They need special medical attention. And I really want us to think about children in the next few days who are close to the scene, close to some of the victims, and who are close to the horror because they're exposed to television constantly. They need our very special attention and support.
Yeah, as you say, this may indeed not be a medical story, but simply a story of the dead. And we have pointed out so many times that they're not speculating on numbers. We know 300 firemen missing, close to 80 policemen missing in New York, 266 killed in the planes, and we're going to get hundreds more, I fear, and maybe thousands dead in those 2 buildings.
And we hope very shortly to hear from Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
We want to reset, though, as to exactly where we are right now. We're starting this morning. It's 7 o'clock, and normally we'd be signing on the air with Good Morning America, but ABC News has not left the air for the past 22 hours now since the occurrences began yesterday morning at the World Trade Center towers. There are still fires burning at the Pentagon. John McWethy talking about the fact those fires so difficult because that is an old building with a wooden structure in many areas. And this is the scene in downtown New York, the site of the 2 dropped World Trade Center towers, number 7 World Trade Center also down. And you get some sense, this is at a distance, but you get some sense of just what an incredible pile of rubble it is, 5 stories high. And you still see policemen standing there at the intersections with masks over their face. This is the scene overnight as equipment was brought in, fires still burning on that site overnight.
And we will hope to hear from the mayor. How many people were retrieved? How many bodies? And what about all these reports that there were people phoning out through the night?
Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York is joining us this morning. Mr. Mayor, I know this has been an unbelievable past 22 hours for you, and I appreciate your being with us. First of all, what can you tell us about what's going on down at the scene right now?
I can tell you that all through the night, there were over 1,000 people, at some points 2,000 people, working on the rescue effort, trying to move a lot of the large parts of buildings and other debris that are there out of the way, trying to rescue people. We were successful in rescuing two people, and there's a third one that we're in contact with. Hopefully there are others that are near him that we're trying to get out, but at least one person that we're in contact with. And we now have 41 fatalities at this point that we know of. And the reality is that we have, looks like about 202 firefighters that are still missing, and police officers, both New York City and Port Authority police officers. Of the uniformed personnel, we probably have about 260 people that are unaccounted for, that we're searching for. And of course, we don't know what the death toll will be with regard to the actual building.
But 202 firefighters, you say, and 200, I mean, those numbers just tear your heart.
259 uniformed service members, which would be made up of the New York City Fire Department, the New York City Police Department, and the Port Authority Police Department. The 2 people that we rescued late last night or early in the morning were 2 Port Authority police officers.
So I just want to get that straight. You say 259 uniformed people overall, 202 firefighters, did you say?
Correct.
That would leave 57 police or Port Authority
police officers and Port Authority police officers.
Oh,
and then of course we're talking about the possibility of of thousands of people. We don't know the numbers yet with regard to whoever was unlucky enough, unfortunate enough to have been left in the building when the 2 buildings collapsed.
Can you give me some sense of just the magnanimity of this task?
No, the magnanimity of the task is weeks and weeks of cleanup, which we have to take a day at a time, and we will.
You've got essentially a 5-story or higher pile of rubble where each of those buildings were, right?
Correct, and then smaller ones for the other buildings and the other damage that was done. Other buildings came down, other buildings were hit and damaged. So we're going to have to take this a day at a time, and I mean, we'll work our way out of this, and the city is going to come out of this stronger and more determined than it ever was before. But we have to understand that we're all going to have very difficult emotions about this and very difficult feelings about it. We worked late into the night organizing the effort for today and tomorrow, and we have tremendous amount of assistance. We actually have more volunteers than we need right now, which is really wonderful. When I was there...
Mr. Mayor, it's Diane Sawyer.
Yeah, Diane.
I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that 2 had been rescued. You were in contact with a third. Can you tell us how you're in contact with that third person?
We're in voice contact with him. The fire and police rescue team is able to talk to him. He's trapped right now, and they're trying to rescue him, trying to get him out. They're able to talk to him.
You had mentioned before that there had been calls, some cell phone calls. Any other calls?
Yes, there are others.
Still,
there are other reports of calls, and part of the difficulty is making sure you put them all together, and you're not talking about the same ones. So they're in different parts of the area. hoping that they're in contact with people. There's only one that I know of that's an actual ongoing rescue effort right now.
I'm curious as to how that person could have survived. Any sense? I mean, is he in some sort of pocket, or
Yeah,
what do we know?
Yesterday I visited this firefighter at St. Vincent's Hospital, whose entire company was saved because they were in a void. And they were in the void for 5 hours, and their colleagues are missing, and they believe their colleagues may be dead. But this group of 6 or 7 firefighters were in a void, and therefore they were protected. And when they finally were extricated, they were shocked to find that the whole building had come down because they had been in this protected void. They heard the explosion, they heard everything else, but everything just fell around them. So we're hopeful that there are going to be other situations like this in this mass building collapses, that there'll be areas where there were protected pockets.
Mr. Mayor, you mentioned the 41 fatalities that you know about at this point, and we know this is just the beginning. But I wonder if you can give us any sense of how many people were reported missing overnight. Any sense of that magnitude?
No, I don't have the civilian numbers in terms of reported missing. I don't know how many. I would just be guessing at that number. I know we had 1,700 injuries that we know of people that we took to the hospital, or people that where we accounted for their injuries, anywhere from very serious to minor injuries. So that means 1,700 injuries.
A couple of other
from
reports.
One incident is horrendous, obviously.
Sure. A couple of other reports I wanted to ask you about. One report that ferries were ferrying bodies across the river and across the Hudson River as often as 10 minutes into the night.
You mean? Are you talking about dead bodies?
That's right.
I don't know of that report.
The dead are being taken to the medical examiner's office?
Yes, they're all. Right now, the procedure is that they're all being taken to the medical examiner's office. Medical examiner Hirsch is confident that he can handle at least the original numbers. We have another site in the Bronx and then another site in Manhattan, but right now, as I said, there's only 41 that we can account for.
Mr. Mayor, let me ask you about the conditions of the city of New York. Last night we heard that everything essentially south of 14th Street, and for those people around the country who don't know New York very well, that's an enormous amount of real estate territory, a lot of neighborhoods,
sure,
very major neighborhoods.
That area is the third largest business district in the country. Midtown Manhattan is the largest, Chicago, and then the lower Manhattan is the third largest business district in the United States. So that gives you a sense of the scope of it. The scope of it is it's a very, very big area, and probably the financial capital of the world.
And that is going to be closed down to all but emergency vehicles for how long?
That's going to be closed down all day today. We're not going to make a decision until probably this afternoon about tomorrow, again, because we want to take this a day at a time. But the core area where the cleanup is being done, I mean, you're talking in terms of days and weeks that it's going to take to clean that up.
Right.
And we want to do it carefully. There's also the consideration that it's a crime scene, so we want to work under the direction of the police and the FBI to make sure that we retain the evidence that they're going to need to figure out what happened, and hopefully be able to bring people to justice for this.
And a question about the heightened security in New York, Mr. Mayor. We have reports this morning that the aircraft carrier USS George Washington is now in position off the coast of the city. We also have reports that NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, has gone on alert and activated F-15, F-16 fighter planes flying combat air patrol over New York. And AWACS planes are now currently up in the air. Just asking you, are there any signs, any warnings that there could be more, that there might be something today?
I checked as of 15 minutes ago, and there are no specific threats of any kind. There is general concern, as there should be, and I appreciate very, very much the personal concern of the President of the United States Navy, all of whom called us yesterday and talked to us. And they're taking special precautions because of what happened yesterday. But there is no specific piece of information. But the people of the city of New York very much appreciate that. Obviously, as they wake up this morning, they're going to be confronting an attack on New York and on the United States in dimensions that we've never experienced before in our history. And the assistance and the help and the security that that offers to the people of the city, I think are very important, if for no other reason but psychological.
Mr. Mayor, I know that you get focused on what do I have to do next in each incremental step and what decision needs to be made. But to talk to you a little bit about the macro of all of this, the overall situation, there is no more visible symbol of New York than the World Trade Center. It has dominated the skyline of this city for more than 30 years. And you plan for these things, and there's all sorts of horrible scenarios that you have to think about. But what was your gut yesterday?
Oh, the feelings that I had yesterday, I think I'll be thinking about for the rest of my life. I lost some very, very good friends, people that I know very, very well, personal friends, and talked to some of them just a few minutes before they died. So you've got to put those feelings as much in the background as possible and focus on the effort that we have ahead of us. And I agree with you. The World Trade Center was one of the great visible symbols of New York, but the real symbol of New York is the spirit of its people. These are we're the most diverse people in the world. We're very, very strong people. We're very proud Americans, and New Yorkers are going to give an example to the people who attacked us of how people who love democracy react to something like this. We're going to be stronger as a result of having gone through this.
But you were talking to some friends in that building who I suspect knew they were going to die.
No. Right before the collapse, I talked to several of the high command of the fire department.
Sure.
That and a Roman Catholic priest, Father Michael Judge, who's a chaplain for the fire department, who I've known for many years. And we were moving our command center to 75 Barclay Street, and they were remaining at West Street in order to have a view of the rescue effort. So I said goodbye to them and wished them luck, and asked Father Judge to pray for us, which I often did. And then a few minutes later, we're notified that part of the building collapse had fallen in their area. So, I mean, I think all New Yorkers are going to experience what I and the fire commissioner and the police commissioner experienced yesterday, that we've lost people that are close friends. The numbers here are so great. We have to feel that, we have to understand we're going to feel it, and then we have to focus on how we clean up this horrible debris, which we're going to do. And we're going to, hopefully, I'm very hopeful we're going to find more people. We're going to rescue some more people, and we're going to keep at it until we're sure of that.
Mr. Mayor, I can't thank you enough for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the coverage. It was enormously helpful yesterday. A lot of people used the television coverage as a way of figuring out how to get out of there, and you were enormously helpful to many of our citizens, and I thank you very much.
Well, we thank you for being with us. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Let us turn right now, because we have with us live Secretary of State Colin Powell. And Mr. Secretary, we're so grateful to you for joining us this morning. I'm going to start right in on a news report, if I can. There is a report that American embassies around the world are being asked to shut down. Is this true?
We have given discretion to all of our ambassadors to close down or temporarily suspend operations based on their judgment of the threat level. 25% of our embassies overseas are currently shut down or have suspended operations, but there are no direct threats yet to any of those embassies. It's precautionary in nature, and I expect they will all be resuming operations as soon as possible. Let me also express my deepest sadness and my condolences to the families of those who lost their lives, and once again reinforce the determination of the United States government to respond with all the forces at its disposal, as the President said last night. And we're hard at work at that already on the diplomatic front here in the State Department this morning.
Do you have signals that there is more to come today?
I have no signals that there is more to come today, but one never knows. But so far, nothing to suggest that there is something waiting to happen today, and let's hope that is the case.
Mr. Secretary, did we miss any signals in the last couple of weeks, or were there simply no signals?
In the first 24 hours of analysis, I have not seen any evidence that there was a specific signal that we missed. There is always a general level of concern about terrorist activity, and there are always warnings that are out there, but they are seldom specific enough to be actionable. Many times they do happen to be actionable, and a lot of terrorist incidents have been stopped because we did get intelligence. In this case, we did not have intelligence of anything of this scope or magnitude. And so America has suffered a terrible loss, but what has not been lost is our spirit, our resiliency as a society. They have failed in that. As the President said last night, we will go after them, and what we will especially do is go after those nations, those states, those organizations that provide haven for this kind of activity, and we will not let up. And we'll make sure that all of our friends and allies and those who would be our friends who have anything to do with harboring this kind of activity will discover that they cannot have a friendly relationship with the United States if they continue to do so.
But, Mr. Secretary, do you share the sense that so many do, that this was so sophisticated, so well planned, that it had to have taken years?
I wouldn't say it had to take years, but it certainly took an extended period of time. It was a very sophisticated, well-planned, well-coordinated attack, showing that it just wasn't done by your average car bomber, but a very sophisticated organization. And the evidence will accumulate in the course of the next several days, which will, I think, point us in the right direction as to who is responsible for it.
But we know there is so much anger welling up in the country right now. I've got the Daily News here, the New York Daily News, which has a headline, "It's War." First of all, is it war as you see it? And if it's Osama bin Laden, what is going to work against him?
Well, American people have a clear understanding that this is a war. That's the way they see it. You can't see it any other way, whether legally that is correct or not.
You do too?
And yes, I do. And we've got to respond as if it is a war. And we've got to respond in the sense that it isn't going to be solved with a single counterattack against one individual. It's going to be a long-term conflict, and it's going to be fought on many fronts: the military front, the intelligence front, the law enforcement front, the diplomatic front. And it's a war not just against the United States. It's a war against civilization. It's a war against all nations that believe in democracy. But democracy can't be defeated. But now it's going to require all nations who believe in democracy to come out and condemn this kind of activity, to work together to go after those who perpetrate such activity. And it requires that kind of coordinated, complete response on behalf of the civilized communities of the world.
But, Mr. Secretary, so many equations have been made to Pearl Harbor in all of this. It may well be, could well be, that we wind up with a death toll from this higher even than occurred at Pearl Harbor. These were civilians, unsuspecting civilians, that were hit in what they thought would be a secure place. And you wonder, you're very judicious about the commitment of American forces, but you wonder just in terms of planning what's going on and in terms of thinking what's going on and what is, when we find out who did this, a kind of appropriate military response.
Well, first we have to find out who did it, and the response may have many dimensions. It may be military, and I certainly hope we can find people that are targetable and we can take action directly against them. But we shouldn't just wait for a single target and then go after it militarily. There are many other things we can be doing to root out these networks, to pull up these places of haven, to destroy training camps. And it's going to take a concerted, long-term effort.
Mr. Secretary, there are reports, this is George Stephanopoulos, reports from Afghanistan this morning that UN officials are being evacuated and also diplomats from Australia, the United States, and Germany. Has the United States recommended that evacuation?
George, I need to check on that. I hadn't received those reports at the time I came down here, but that would seem to be a prudent action.
One other thing, Mr. Secretary, do we have any idea what happened in Kabul last night?
Not entirely, but does not appear to be related to what happened in New York and Washington. It seems to be a separate incident that relates to other activities, not directly related to this attack.
That may have been occasioned by what happens in New York? Was it some sort of a rebel group going after the Taliban? Do we know anything?
That seems to be the case, but I do not have any reason to believe it is related to what happened in New York.
And I just want to follow up on what I thought I heard you say earlier. If it came to U.S. ground troops in Afghanistan in order to go after Osama bin Laden, would you back that?
As the President said, we will do whatever is necessary to deal with this, and I would not remove any of the options available to the President. As you said, I'm judicious in the use of force, and I also believe that when it is time to use force, you use it in a decisive way. But we're far from selecting any particular military targets or how to go after those targets at this time. We've got to build a case first.
But talk to me a little bit about very specific language in the president's speech. It was the sentence that struck all of us, that we will not only move against those who perpetrated this, but those who harbored them.
Yeah, the reality is that there are nations, there are organizations out there that give support to these kinds of terrorist activities. They provide facilities, they provide homes, they provide support for them, they provide money for them, and we're going to go after all of them. We're going to make it clear to them that you cannot have any kind of decent relationship with the United States if you do this, and we will go after the support that allows terrorists to perform these kinds of acts.
But that
gives them havens.
That could be many states. That could be not just Afghanistan, it could be other states. And do you contemplate the possibility of military action against?
No, not necessarily. We're contemplating a full court press, whether it's diplomatic, legal, intelligence sharing, and for those nations that we believe can do a better job of policing their borders, of going after this kind of activity, we're going to work with them. We're going to make it clear to them that this will be a standard against which they're measured with respect to their relationship with the United States.
Mr. Secretary, the response you're talking about could take a long time and could be quite controversial in the Middle East. Have you been in contact with Jordan and Egypt, and do you have any indication that they'll support this kind of effort?
I have calls in to all of the leaders in the region. So far this morning, I have spoken to the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Lord Robertson in NATO, and Javier Solana of the European Union. And as soon as these interviews are over, I will be on the phone to leaders in the Middle East as well.
All right, Mr. Secretary, we'll let you get to work then. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Secretary of State Colin Powell, and we appreciate his joining us this morning. I want to go to the lawn of the White House. Terry Moran is there. Terry, some new information?
Well, Charlie, let me just bring you up to date on what we know of the president's doings today. He showed up in the Oval Office a little after 7 a.m. That is typical for him. His National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, already on the scene here in the White House. One detail is that the president, as George mentioned earlier, will be meeting with the congressional leadership, the joint congressional leadership, who will be here in the cabinet room, and he will be meeting with them at 11:30 this morning. There's also going to be a blood drive set up on the White House grounds, in the White House complex at the old Executive Office building, and the President and the First Lady intend to drop by that blood drive here. The officials here are encouraging all of us who work at the White House to donate blood, and the President and the First Lady will be doing the same. It is going to be a day, as you can imagine, that is going to be absolutely packed for the President with meetings and decisions about what is the next step to take. In that National Security Council meeting that he chaired last night before retiring for the evening, we were told that he was given a full briefing on the status of the investigation. At that point, things have advanced since then, and that is undoubtedly what he is hearing about now.
All right.
Terry Moran, thank you.
Terry, we do thank you, and as we said, we're going to keep you up to date on everything that is new this morning, and these may be new pictures for you if you weren't up very, very late into the wee hours of the morning, because we received some home video now, and you're going to see it, a picture of the first plane that hit the first World Trade Center tower.
This is American Airlines Flight 11 that was out of Boston, a Boeing 767. This is the plane hitting the first World Trade Center tower, the explosion of flame. No one had any idea it was coming. It was a total surprise. By the time we took air, which was a few minutes later, we had the first pictures of that building. We didn't know if it was an explosion, if it was a bomb, if it was a missile, or if it was an airplane that had mistakenly flied into the World Trade Center tower. But there it is, hitting the tower. American Airlines Flight 11, there were a total of 92 people aboard.
And we'll just repeat again for those of you who certainly saw it yesterday, but none of us will ever forget it, the scene of that second plane coming in. And this is a scene taken by Evan Fairbanks, who is a photographer, a freelance photographer. It's United Airlines Flight 175.
Yeah, this is not the Fairbanks pictures, but this is a picture of the plane. Oh, I don't care how many times you see it. It is just awful. Go ahead. Well, that's the 767. That's the United Flight 175 that flew in just 18 minutes later into the second World Trade Center tower. We showed you the New York Daily News, the tabloid. Did we show the New York Times headline on the paper? The Times, which is always very judicious in its use of headlines, has a banner headline this morning: U.S. attack. And then the sub-headline there says, hijacked jets destroy Twin Towers and hit Pentagon in day of terror. And now the New York Post, we've just gotten our copy of the New York Post, where it says an active war on the, I can't get this position very well, active war on the cover of the plane there, poised in the picture we just saw, about to hit the second World Trade Center tower, and then inside, the day that terror hit home in the United States. I'm sorry, USA Today, John Miller's just holding up USA Today, which is now out, act of war. And the pictures, again, just as grisly as they are in every other newspaper. I want to go to ABC's Cynthia McFadden, who has been covering the casualty situation at the hospitals in New York. And Cynthia, I don't know if you heard the mayor when he was with us, but he gave us some numbers on fatalities, 41 fatalities, civilian fatalities that they have found so far. And that number obviously is very premature. 202 firefighters missing, and you have to worry or presume that they may be dead, and 57 other uniformed officers. That's New York policemen and Port Authority police, but I know you've been covering those who were injured at the hospitals.
Well, and Charlie, of course, what no one wants to say is the fact that the hospitals are not treating more victims this morning is very bad news indeed. They have been working all night trying to excavate people, but this morning, St. Vincent's, at the trauma center at Chelsea Piers, there just are not people being brought here for treatment. The doctors are ready, but they are not available. I have Governor Pataki here with me. He was come down to visit the hospital, as well as he's toured the entire Ground Zero site last night and this morning. Governor, thanks for joining us this morning. What can you tell us from being at Ground Zero?
Well, it is incredible to see the devastation. You can imagine it, but when you actually see block after block of concrete that's been turned to dust and rubble all over the place, it's an incredible scene. But amidst that devastation, you see firefighters and police officers and National Guard troops down there with tremendous courage, risking their lives, going through the search and rescue operation, cleaning the debris, and hoping that we can recover more people alive.
Governor, we understand that until very late last night, they weren't really even able to begin the digging effort.
When I was down there last night, they actually had people at the site of the towers themselves, and it was incredibly courageous to see, because right next door there was still another high-rise on fire, in flames, that had a risk of collapsing. But they're just incredibly courageous heroes down there, risking their lives in the hopes that we can save some additional lives. Governor, tell us your reaction to the sights you saw last night. It's just incredible to see, but we've also seen sites that are inspirational. New Yorkers coming together, lining up for blocks to give blood, volunteering here at the hospitals. And, you'd look in the eyes of the firefighters down there last night, covered with dust and debris, and you could sense the sorrow as they tried to recover some of their colleagues who are buried in that rubble. But you could also sense the inspiration and the courage and the strength that they are showing. And it's that courage and strength that's going to get us through this, and that's going to allow us to come back stronger and not have our freedom taken from us by this horrible terrorist act.
Governor, of course, the fact that so few victims are being brought to the hospitals this morning is a very bad sign. What are the emergency services personnel telling you? What's the briefing this morning?
We just don't know. We do believe that there are still people alive in the rubble. There have been some indications of cell phone communications. Late last night, 2 Port Authority police officers were taken from the rubble alive and were saved. So the focus now is on search and rescue. We have 18 search and rescue teams down there, more coming from as far away as Puerto Rico. We're not going to give up hope, and we're just going to do everything we can to try to save every life possible.
Are you persuaded that at this point the state has all the resources it needs to be able to continue the search and rescue?
The cooperation and support has been enormous. The city has the best professional firefighters and police officers in the world. The state support, National Guard and emergency services has been tremendous in their help, and the federal officials have given us everything we've wanted. And of those 18 search and rescue teams, we have them from Connecticut, we have them from surrounding states and from all across America. And we're very grateful for that outpouring of support.
Thank you, Governor Pataki, for joining us this morning. Charlie, Diane, back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Cynthia McFadden and Governor Pataki. Appreciate your stopping and talking to Cynthia. And as the mayor, Mayor Giuliani, said to us just a few moments ago, this process of untangling this massive amount of material that is there in the World Trade Center area is going to take weeks, if not months, and they have to treat it as a crime scene, not only as a search scene, but a crime scene, and that makes it take even longer.
That's right. As we promised, we're going to bring you up to date on everything new this morning about those who did it and how they did it. And we're going to start because we've got investigative reporter Brian Ross here, and he's been talking to the FBI.
Well, Diane, in the last 25 minutes or so, FBI agents have entered the home of a man by the name of Muhammad Atta in Venice, Florida. He is one of two people who they had a APB, all points bulletin, out for overnight, looking for a car registered to him and another car registered to a rental service in Boca Raton, Florida.
Who is he? What do we know about him?
We don't know anything about him. There's been quite a bit of activity in Florida overnight. Agents also are following up leads of a car found, as we had reported earlier, at the Daytona Beach Airport, where there was a picture of Omar bin Laden found in the car. And the owner of the car reportedly was a student at a flight school in Daytona Beach, Florida, who had been kicked out of the school. One highly placed source in Washington said that, told us overnight that the executive branch has concluded that the list of suspects will be small because there must be highly trained pilots who have been involved, and they are looking through the various flight schools and connections that way.
Okay. What led them to Florida? Do we know, Brian? And do we have any idea what led them to this individual? Because obviously the planes were not hijacked from there. It was far north of there.
Right. The best leads have come from the flight manifest. By 1:30, 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, they were running names off the list of passengers on the plane. And that seems to have been one of the ways they got to both South Florida to Daytona Beach. And then, of course, in the Boston area, there are a number of people they're looking for as well.
Brian asked you to stick around because we're going to turn now to crime and justice specialist John Miller, who's with us this morning. There are other details emerging this morning about who and how?
They've been going over the tapes of the 911 calls made from the plane and analyzing the accounts of different passengers. And in more than one flight, the FBI has come into a theory that there was a plan here to, on takeoff, while the seatbelt lights were still on, to attack the flight attendants with knives and box cutters in the cabin as a diversion to lure the pilot or the co-pilot out of the cockpit to investigate the commotion in the cabin. As soon as that door was open, then storming inside to take control of the plane. And that's the operating theory on at least two of these flights from what they've been able to analyze.
So they attacked the flight attendants.
Right.
Lured the pilots out and then went into the cockpits.
On most domestic flights, certainly with American carriers, the procedure is that the cockpit door is locked. So they had to come up with some kind of ruse to gain entry into the cockpit. And it seems to be attacking the flight attendants was designed to draw somebody from the cockpit out.
Just one more time to go over a report that we talked about earlier in the morning, and people are joining us as the morning goes on. But Brian was talking about these activities by federal agents in the state of Florida. And we've also had reports this morning that in Boston, they have seized a car which apparently was used by hijackers that went into the Boston airport. They had apparently come down from Canada through Portland, Maine, rented a car there, and driven to Boston to carry out the hijackings.
That's one of the reports, and this morning we're being told, again, to focus on the fact that that is a very, as they say, soft border. That's an easy access point back and forth. And if you recall, at the time of the millennium, where they had a number of arrests of, or searches of people in the Boston area connected with a possible terrorist suspect at that point.
And flight manuals also, John, found in that car?
That's right. Flight manuals in Arabic were found in a national rent-a-car that was at the central parking area at Logan Airport. The car had been rented by one man, and by going through the manifest, they've identified 5 names. 2 of them are brothers. 1 of them is a pilot that they're focusing on, and it appears to be a different pilot from the man in Florida. So it looks like there were a number of people, 2 or more, who had in-flight experience and who may have trained others.
And does it surprise you they left this kind of evidence behind?
In a suicide mission, I'm sure being traced or caught was probably not their concern.
Yeah, there's an ironic detail that they got to the Logan airport so late that their luggage didn't make the plane. I can't imagine that's of much concern.
Well, it's interesting because in most carriers there's a system of passenger claiming where where the opposite is true. If your luggage makes the plane and you don't, it doesn't take off. The opposite doesn't apply, though.
Yeah. All right, John Miller, Brian Ross, thanks very much. Senator John McCain, Republican of Arizona, is joining us this morning. Senator McCain, can you hear me? Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Charlie Gibson and Diane Sawyer here, and I appreciate your joining us. We were just talking to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and about what really is appropriate response in this instance, and the fact that this country is angry right now, really angry. Your sense of that?
Well, I agree, Charlie. This country is very angry, and controlled fury, I guess, is as good a description. And there's no doubt that Americans have every right to demand a complete and thorough response. The question is, obviously, who did it, and I thought the President last night made a very important point in his excellent speech to the nation, where he said that not only do those organizations have to be punished, but those nations that shelter them as well, and that's going to be something which I think may be a long-term project.
Well, and we've made the point a number of times this morning, Senator, but it's a very difficult one, and it will present a great conundrum for this administration and for the military establishment, for the Congress, that indeed this could be, if it turns out to be bin Laden or bin Laden connected, that this could be not just one nation, but it could be a number that have harbored people involved in this organization.
I agree, but I think unless we get out at the fundamental problem, and that is that there is a network, a veritable network in that part of the world. We know there was allegations concerning Iranian participation in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. There's been allegations about Iraq, Libya, even North Korea. So I don't think there's any doubt that there's a system out there, or a network, and that network is going to have to be attacked, and this may be a very long-term proposition, but I'm convinced that the American people will stay the course, as we have in other times of crisis.
There's patience, you think, in this country about this?
I think there's an understandable impatience, but I believe the President will explain to the American people that this has to be done in a measured and methodical fashion. Just launching a bunch of cruise missiles, the so-called pinprick responses that we employed before, are not going to do it, and everybody knows that. So it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of American treasure, and perhaps some American blood.
Senator McCain, we thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And as we know, there are going to be congressional meetings throughout the day, congressional briefings. Hope to hear more from you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go now to Don Daler, who is on the scene, and we like to stay in touch and see exactly what's happening down with the firefighters, down with the policemen. We have seen that smoke, that wall, that towering wall of smoke now subside, but as we know, they're still dealing with very, very tricky terrain down there, and we are also receiving some reports of perhaps additional survivors. We're not sure of those. Don, what are you hearing? Sorry. Don Daler is apparently having technical trouble down there, and no wonder. It's a very complicated area.
But just to recap what Diane's talking about, maybe we'll get the connection with Don, who is down right at the site where the recovery efforts are going on, such as they are right now. But the mayor earlier told us that they had found 2 people alive, and that they were in contact with a third and were trying to find that person. And he said there were a number of other calls, cell phone calls, that had come out of the rubble, but they couldn't tell exactly how reliable some of those reports were of calls that had come out. He said there's really only one person that we know is in there and alive, and we're trying to find him. So we will try to get to Don Daler in just a few moments. Also joining us this morning, former director of the CIA, Admiral Jim Woolsey, who is with us. Admiral Woolsey, can you hear me?
Above Army Captain, Charlie. Just Mr. is fine.
Okay. All right. Mr. then. Your sense, I've asked a number of people, and I would ask you the same thing. Your sense of where we're going to be a week from now, what kinds of things we're going to learn over the next few days?
Well, I hope very much we're going to start looking hard at who might have been behind this, and I don't mean just bin Laden. This operation looks quite sophisticated and rather broad-based, the sort of operation that might well have an intelligence service of a country behind it. And the Clinton administration at first pursued in '93 and '94, and the FBI did, the possibility that Iraq was behind the World Trade Center bombing in '93. And then it abandoned that theory and moved off to believing that most of these terrorist operations were loose associations of people who just sort of came together, or later on, bin Laden. But it didn't go back to looking for a possibility of state sponsorship behind them. It's time now to resuscitate that. Look, there is, I think, a fair amount of opinion growing that the Iraqi government could conceivably have been behind the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. And the difference between this act of war against the United States and December 7th, 1941, is in 1941 we saw those red rising suns on the wings of the attacking aircraft, and we knew who had attacked us. Now it's fine for us to be angry. It's fine for us to want to respond. It's fine for us to say it's an act of war. I think all of those things are true. But we need to get quite clear exactly who may have been responsible for this. The President talked last night about harboring terrorists. Afghanistan harbors bin Laden, and he may well have been involved, but there may have been more involved here than harboring. Could have been somebody else behind that.
How could, given the sophistication of this operation, the question that's going to be asked a lot in coming months, how did U.S. intelligence miss it?
Well, I think there's several things to be said. One is they may, we've really heard from the Secretary this morning, have picked up generally that something was going to happen, but not that this particularly was. Secondly, they have stopped a number of other terrorist incidents, including a number right around the time of Y2K, but this is a business in which you have to stop everything, and this was a terrible tragedy. A third thing is that the CIA guidelines issued in '95, I'd hasten to say after I left, make it difficult, not impossible, but difficult to recruit people inside terrorist organizations as spies, because they put a deterrent on if you're trying to recruit someone with a violent past. Well, you know, the only people inside terrorist organizations are violent people. You don't just recruit nice people if you want to learn what's going on in terrorist organizations. And then finally, I think they may have been looking very, very hard at the terrorist organizations themselves, but not enough at the possibility of a state behind it, whether Iraq, Iran, I think is less likely, or some other. But I think Iraq would have to be the principal candidate.
Before we let you go, one other question, though. There were not only restrictions put on the CIA in the period of time that you talk about after you left, but there were restrictions put on the kind of intelligence that could be gathered, particularly back in the 70s, when a lot of people feel to some extent the CIA was dismantled. Well, one of the things that may come out of this, will it be, do you think, a really thorough going over of U.S. intelligence capabilities and, in effect, to some extent, unfetter the CIA?
Well, I hope that human intelligence, which is really the main way you're going to get intelligence about terrorist organizations, gets back some of the resources that they had for the Y2K period, and they've been slimmed down, unfortunately, since then. But I think George Tenet, the DCI, takes a real interest in human intelligence, and he's worked very hard to do the best he can with the resources that he's given. I think it's mainly a question of resources and removing some of these constraints that are the result of political events of the past, wholly unrelated to terrorism.
All right, thanks. Jim Woolsey, I appreciate you being with us this morning. Thanks. Thank you very much. All the best to you.
All right, I want to check because I believe we have Don Daylor up now, and I want to make sure that we do. Can you just tell me in my ear? Yes, Don, we see you there down at the scene, and as we said, we are hearing reports of additional survivors. Can you tell us anything more?
That's right. Well, you remember back at Oklahoma City when little bits of good news started to trickle in as time went by. That's the case now. We have the report that there have been 6 survivors pulled out, one of whom is a Port Authority police officer named Jay McLaughlin. He has been taken to the hospital. The Port Authority police wanted us to announce that so that his family would know that he is okay. That's one individual we know about. In addition to that, there were 5 firemen recovered from the World Trade Center alive and taken to the hospital. I have with me here Fireman Bill Duty. Now, why is it that do you believe that they were able to survive such a horrendous accident?
Well, they were fortunate enough to fall into a void. When the building fell, there must have been a part of the structure that kind of surrounded them and protected them from the falling debris. So when the debris fell on the side, they were in an air pocket, and they just stayed there until help arrived. I don't know what company they were from, but there were 5 firefighters and 1 officer, so 6 men.
Were they badly injured?
I don't know how the injuries were, but I know they got them out, so...
Does this give you hope that there will be other survivors being pulled out?
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of hope, especially for people that were below grade, because there's a lot of voids down there. The building, the first few floors is kind of still intact. So I'm hoping that most people under grade, there might be a lot of voids, but unfortunately most people that were above the first few floors, very little hope as far as I know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing, Charlie. As we were walking through this massive debris field a little bit earlier, one of the things that struck me was it is a huge debris field, but for the size of those buildings, it really didn't seem like it would be that size. You would think it was much, much larger than that until you realize that there are parts of the World Trade Center all around us. The building was literally pulverized. There is a fine dust for miles around this area. And that is why that it's not just one big pile there that you would imagine. You can only get an idea of how huge these buildings were if you stood in their shadow before this happened.
Yes, and another point that I think needs to be made, and we'll find out more about that, is we learned at the time of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, those buildings went way down. Actually, they went 70 feet into bedrock. There were garages below, and obviously there's going to be a lot of sunken debris as well. But the pile of debris, 5, 6 stories high. And as Mayor Giuliani said, it is going to be weeks, maybe even months before they've gone through all of it.
I think I mentioned last night that when I went down there, you can hear a groan from the still standing parts of the buildings. It's an actual sound, almost like an avalanche about to pour down on you. Well, we want to go to ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation, because we said there is news this morning both about what may have happened on board these flights and also some additional information about air travel today in the U.S. Let me just start and ask you, first of all, what do we know now about airlines resuming operation today?
Well, we know that the Federal Aviation Administration, Diane, is still hoping to get planes back in the air starting around noon today. Airline sources tell us they're still waiting for final word from the FAA on the exact security measures that will be taken. That has not officially come down yet, so they're waiting on that before they figure out what they're going to do today. But the FAA says it hopes to have flights resuming around noon. We expect in about 2.5 hours to hear officially from the Department of Transportation announcing what exactly will be taking place to try to get flights back in the air. You're putting up some of the things we've learned that they will be implementing. No curbside check-in. They'll be doing random ID checks, both of employees and passengers. Only passengers past the checkpoints and on. Obviously, a tightening of security, like the type of security we saw during the Gulf War. You're also expected to see much more visible security at the airports. Local police, possibly some military police as well, will be at a number of the airports, especially in the Washington, D.C. and the New York City area as well. It will take the airlines time to ramp up. One airline I spoke with this morning said there's a number of scenarios on the table. Perhaps by late this afternoon they could be at 20% ramp up. It will take a number of days for them to get the systems back up and running and to get planes going again.
Yes, I gather the airports just look like parking lots at the moment. Since there are no planes in the air, they're all on the ground in airports and have to be parked. There are not enough gates to accommodate them.
I'm sure that's probably true. The airplanes are just sitting there. They are not even where they would normally be at this time in the morning because they didn't go on to whatever their final destinations would be. So that's another sort of thing that the airlines and their operations center have to work out. What airplane is where and where do they need to get that airplane to? Charlie, I have some new information about the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center that I'd like to tell you about this morning that I've just managed to gather from some government sources of mine. We were talking about earlier about this code that the pilot can push a button and send a code. The code is 7500, by the way, to let controllers know that the plane is being hijacked. We had some indications that no code was sent. I have another government source now that indicates to me that, in fact, none of the planes sent that particular code out, indicating that a hijacking was in progress. On top of that, I have learned that those hijackers apparently were very, very sophisticated in how these planes worked and what they needed to do. Because what I have learned this morning from government sources is that on the 2 planes, at least, that went into the World Trade Tower, apparently on the American Airlines Flight 11, the transponder on that plane was turned off entirely. Now, this is the system that sends a signal to air traffic controllers. It identifies the plane, the altitude, things like that. And apparently the transponder was turned off on American Flight 11, according to government sources. And what that would mean is that all controllers are seeing is a blip on their screen, no information about the particular plane, no information about its altitude, what plane it is. As they say, they're just getting a skin paint off of the plane. On the United Airlines flight 175, someone apparently changed the transponder code on that one, and what that does, I'm told, is that the computer then doesn't recognize the plane anymore. So again, they're not getting good information about what plane it is, what altitude it is at, only seeing blips on their screen. So whoever was doing that in the cockpit had that carefully planned so that no one could know what was going on and what the intentions were at the time.
And yet a couple of other reports out this morning, Lisa, that initially on Flight 11, that first plane to go into the first tower, air traffic controllers could hear someone, that the pilot had pushed a button and allowed them to hear apparently the hijackers talking in English, saying what?
I have 2 conflicting sources on that this morning, Diane. I have one government source that says that's not inconsistent with the reports that they have heard, that for a time the microphone was keyed open on that American Airlines Flight 11, the first flight to go into the World Trade Tower. That source could not tell me what was being said. I talked to a second government source who indicated that they were not sure that the mic was keyed open on that plane. So I think this is still information that's developing, and we just don't know for certain if the pilot had in fact opened the microphone and some conversations were being heard.
But I'm fascinated by that information that the transponders were turned off and that they never sent the hijacking signal. What that would tell me, and you're far more sophisticated in this than I am, what that would tell me is that the hijackers had the controls of those planes very early in the flight.
Or clearly were threatening enough to at least direct pilots to do that particular action. I mean, if the transponders were turned off or changed in some way, as I said, someone was very, very sophisticated in knowing that that's what they needed to do. Not to become a stealth aircraft, obviously. They're still being able to be seen on radar, but really there was no communication with these planes, I believe, from controllers. At least one of the plane, all the communication systems were shut down. I don't know exactly what plane that was. So these hijackers wanted to be as isolated as they could up there to keep people guessing what was going on as they carried out their attacks.
All right, thanks very much. Lisa Stark is joining us from Seattle, Washington.
I want to check now because, as we know, it is a national tragedy, but for so many families, for so many individuals around the country, it is, well, there's just an infinity of human heartbreak out there. And part of this modern age is that so many people say that they heard cell phone calls coming in, that they heard from loved ones. There's the flight attendant who called to say what was going on board. There is a son who called his father to say he thought they were going to crash. There is the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who called her husband twice saying that there were men on board a plane with knives and the passenger reportedly hiding out in the bathroom of a plane, who called 911. Well, I want to bring in, if we can, Alice and Vaughn Hoagland. And Alice Hoagland is the mother of Mark Hoagland. Vaughn is his uncle, and they are joining us from Sarasota, California this morning. And first of all, we can only say to you that we are so grateful in this horrible moment that you came and are with us this morning, and we thank you. Mrs. Hoagland.
Very glad you asked us.
Mrs. Hoagland, tell me what happened. What was the call that came in?
Well, at 6:45 yesterday morning, the phone rang. A friend of the family, Carol Phipps, answered it, ran to get my sister-in-law, Mark's aunt, Kathy. He said to her, "I wanted to let you know that I love you." And Kathy told him, "Well, we love you, Mark." And then she went to get me. I ran to the phone. Mark said, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham." He gave me his last name. He was so rattled. He said, "I want to let you know that I love you." I told him that we all love him. He said that he was on United Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, and that there were 3 guys who had taken over the aircraft, and they say they have a bomb. I asked him, "Who are these people?" And he seemed distracted, didn't hear the question, didn't answer. Then he came back on, said, "It's true." And I said, "I believe you." I told him I love him, and then it went dead. He was not calling from a cell phone. He was calling from the air phone, probably at his seat. He was seated at the back of first class toward the front of the aircraft. It was a pretty light load that day. We were hoping that Mark had a chance to perhaps work with other passengers to thwart the intent of these hijackers.
Yes, you point out, this is Charlie Gibson, you point out...
Hello, Mr. Gibson.
How are you?
Fine.
And boy, I mean, you know, everybody, the stories in all of this are so heart-rending, and yours obviously so much so. And that flight, for people who aren't aware and can't keep all these planes straight, this is the plane that had left Newark headed for San Francisco, and that's the plane that crashed in western Pennsylvania, southeast of the city of Pittsburgh. And there are actually reports that perhaps, and I hope it is some consolation to you, there are reports that perhaps the passengers on that plane were able to overwhelm the hijackers.
We hope so. We know that Mark was a very active and take-charge guy. He was a large man. It's likely, based on things that we've heard, that he was able to participate in at least thwarting the efforts of these people that took control of the aircraft. We know that of the 4 aircraft that were hijacked, his was the only one that didn't reach its target. And we hope that Mark was able to take an active stand against these folks.
When he called you to express his love to you and to his aunt, did you have a sense from him, or did he say explicitly that he thought this plane was going to go down?
No, he didn't have a chance to say anything like that. I could tell by his voice that he was quite concerned. He was calm, but I could tell he was frightened. Telling me his last name, this is Mark Bingham. Incidentally, he is a big supporter of Senator John McCain. We were very touched by the eloquence of Senator McCain earlier. He is a very patriotic young man, as is his Aunt Kathy. And all of us here, we're very touched by the words of our president. We hope that this horrible set of events will help to bring the American people together in a real effort against this kind of terrorism. I'm a flight attendant for United Airlines, and as is my sister. Mark was flying on a companion pass from my sister Candace Hoagland.
And did you watch the television reports, Ms. Hoagland, Mr. Hoagland, or was it harder?
It was difficult to watch all of them.
As soon as we got the call from Mark, we called the FBI, and we turned on the TV and realized that this horrible thing that Mark was involved in was part of a national crisis.
His flight was actually the last to meet its final end, so we had hopes that maybe something would happen where he'd be able to, he's an active guy, and he's not one to sit on his hands, and I think that if there was anything done to thwart the people, that he was involved in it. I know him, and I know the way he thinks, and he would not sit idly by, especially since there's a good chance that I think that he probably knew that it was indeed a suicide mission. He has access to Palm Pilots and internet capabilities, a pretty electronic savvy guy. And I think that somehow he found out that they had no intention of landing any of the passengers safely, and he took it upon himself, maybe recruited other people. We have hopes.
And now, this is News 10 Good Morning.
Boy, what a moving interview. You are watching News 10 Good Morning. It's Wednesday, September 12th, and I'm Dan Elliott.
I'm Alicia Malaby. We're going to continue with our coverage of the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. in just a moment. But first, we want to update you on our forecast. Monica Woods is here with the weather.
Well, here's a look at our out-the-door forecast today. We are expecting quite a bit of cloud cover. Let's take a look at that out-the-door forecast for today. Partly cloudy skies throughout today, so we've got white up on the weather tower. Here's a look at what we're expecting for the morning commute. Mostly clear at 57, but lunchtime forecast partly cloudy, 73, and drive time partly cloudy, 84. More on the forecast coming up. Alicia and Dan, back to you.
All right, let's go on over to the News 10 Traffic Center and check in with Beth Duncan. Beth?
Good morning, Dan, Alicia. Good morning, everyone. Let me tell you what's happening this morning in terms of travel as we take a check of the maps. Everything is moving well in and around Sacramento. If you are going to try to head out to Sac International Airport, you must be aware by now that it is closed and will remain closed today. So you certainly don't need to be out there for any reason, but if you are traveling out there, you will obviously be involved in security checks at that location. BART was suspended. It is running again. If you're headed to the Bay Area, you can use BART. In San Francisco, police have put the entire city in step 1 emergency mode. That means all bridges and tunnels are under heightened watch at that location. We don't have any major incidents or accidents on any of our local freeways, so if you are headed west to work this morning to the Bay Area, either out of Sacramento or the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley area, everything is moving as well as it can at this point, and arriving at your destination should be fairly typical, perhaps even lighter. Outside Live, let's take a look at what's happening. 99 at Mac, certainly some action there, but no major delays on any of our local freeways. That's the first check of traffic this morning. Back to you guys.
All right, we want to recap quickly what has happened over the last 24 hours, and then we'll go back to ABC's coverage. Just before 6 a.m. local time yesterday, a passenger jet slammed into one of the World Trade Center towers, and the people down below looked up in shock and disbelief. No one was sure what to make of that first crash until they saw this. About 18 minutes later, a second passenger jet slammed through the other Trade Center tower, exploding in a giant fireball. Debris rained down on the streets below.
And shortly after that, witnesses reported seeing the fuselage and tail of a jet disappear into the Pentagon building, followed by a huge explosion. The aftermath, a gaping hole and twisted metal, debris, and fire. Just when some of the nation's worst fears were being realized, another jet crashed outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That flight was destined for San Francisco. Later reports indicated all 4 planes had been hijacked by people with knives. The death toll, of course, is being assessed.
We want to keep you updated on the local weather and traffic picture. We'll check in every 10 minutes, but in the meantime, back to ABC's live coverage.
Now, that disaster declaration allows New Yorkers who have been affected by the attack on the World Trade Center to apply for federal aid. That could be it could be housing assistance, it could be medical assistance, it could be crisis counseling, it could be unemployment benefits. There's all kinds of different benefits that entitles people to who have been affected by a disaster, and this is certainly, albeit man-made, this is certainly a disaster here in New York. And as we reported, the entire city, from 14th Street right to the tip of Manhattan Island, has been closed down for at least today. And as Mayor Giuliani pointed out, that's actually the 3rd largest urban area. Forget the rest of New York. That by itself is the 3rd largest urban area in the United States. That entire area shut down for the day, and they're going to make this decision on whether to close it down day by day. But as he pointed out, the area where the World Trade Center was, the World Trade Center complex, and it was a complex of buildings, 3 of which have now gone down, that will be closed for weeks and months. But it's really, for a New Yorker, and I understand many of you do not live in the city, but for a New Yorker, the fact that that much of the city has now been closed down is really startling. All of the financial centers, for instance, down in that area, and many very prominent neighborhoods.
Again, if you missed Mayor Giuliani earlier, he brought us up to date on casualty figures. He said he didn't know how many people had been reported missing overnight. They simply didn't have a tally on that. He talked about at least 1,000, more than 1,000 people whom he knew had been taken to hospitals and who were injured. He talked about 41 fatalities.
41 fatalities, 202 firefighters who are missing. Now, maybe that number's been brought down since they found 5 alive, but 202 that were missing and presumed dead at the time he talked to us, which was an hour ago, and 57 uniformed police officers. That's New York City Police and Port Authority Police, and among the firefighters in New York. And this is a great department here in New York, and we have talked a lot about firefighters and how important they are in the last year. 202 is a staggering number, and among that number, some of the top officials of the New York City Fire Department. The first group of firefighters, 400 firefighters who went into the World Trade Center, apparently about half of them perished.
Including the chief. And that takes us right to Cynthia McFadden, who is down at St. Vincent's Hospital. Cynthia?
Diane, we're on West 11th Street, south of 14th, of course, the closest trauma center to the actual site of the World Trade Center. I have with me the chief of surgery here at St. Vincent's, Dr. Mark Wallach. Has been on duty most of the night, and he has made rounds this morning and could give us an update on the condition of those 361 people who have been brought to this hospital, 4 of whom have died. Dr. Wallach, tell us about the survivors.
The survivors right now are stable. There's about 60 that we consider to be somewhat critical but stable. Right now, that's all that I really want to report. We're making rounds on them now. You can imagine that when we come in the morning and you have to make rounds on 360 individuals who have come in, been triaged, most been admitted, that it's a very difficult task. The individuals in this institution, from all the paramedical personnel through the medical students from New York Medical College, the residents who work here both in medicine and in surgery, et cetera, done a great job.
Now, many of these people were, tell us where they were in terms of the blast.
Well, some of them were in the building. A lot were outside of the building. I think that it's very apparent to everybody, and it's really sad for me to even talk about it, that a lot of the people in the building probably did not make it out. There were a few that we have here that are telling some tales, but I think that we've treated a lot of personnel who were down there trying to get people out of the building also.
Some of the rescue workers who you treated yesterday and today, this morning, have said that as they were coming out of the building, they saw colleagues going in.
That's correct. Actually, some of the people that were actually working in the building were coming down the steps to get out as they saw fire individuals and police going up to initially try to fight the fire and rescue people before the buildings collapsed.
Dr. Wallach, one of the issues this morning is the fact that your staff here is not busy, which is a terrible sign.
You know, quite honestly, we took 360 hits yesterday, and that's not busy for this kind of catastrophe. That tells the tale to everybody. This is really very, very sad.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wallach. Diane, Charlie, back to you.
Okay, Cynthia, we thank you, and the fire chief who was killed, one of the chiefs was Chief Gansey. We have some news coming in from John Miller. Shortly he's going to be with us, but I want to tell everybody that we asked Mayor Giuliani this morning about reports coming out that a USS aircraft carrier, the George Washington, has been positioned off the coast of New York City, that the North American Defense Command went on alert yesterday, and that F-15s and F-16s are continuing to fly combat air patrol over New York. We asked him if he was expecting anything more today. He said he had been asking that question, and he is not.
John Miller has just gotten here.
There you go.
Hopefully with some news, some new details.
A number of developments, not all of them good. Across the street from the World Trade Center, in one of the tallest buildings in Battery Park City, fire has broken out on the roof. A police helicopter reports that it's billowing black smoke and spreading rapidly, apparently from some burning debris that may have fallen there. In addition, there have been some rescues, dramatic rescues from the scene. Also at Church and Day Street, they've called for 2 sergeants and 20 detectives in the crime scene unit, which indicates they've found either additional bodies or major evidence.
Do we know
things are jumping there now?
Do we know which building?
In Battery Park City, The police helicopter pilot described it in detail as the one with a brass roof at the corner of Battery Park City, and they've notified the fire department, which is certainly stressed enough right now to respond there and deal with it as a high-rise fire.
And presumably they're all evacuated at this point.
From that building, this fire has just broken out minutes ago. So I'm not sure if Battery Park City, those are residential buildings for the most part. That may not be the case.
All right,
Your mic is turned off. I just got a sign saying your mic is turned off. I hope they heard you through my microphone.
Okay.
But just one, or they did hear you through my microphone, so that's good.
Let's go back to Don Daler, because you were talking about the rescues down at the site, and I believe he's with some of the men who made those rescues. Don.
That's right, Diana. I'm here with the Nassau County Emergency Services people who are actually in that part of the wreckage. They are the ones who rescued the police officer who was in there. With me is Mitch Durler. You were actually in the hole with him, correct?
Yes.
Can you describe what you saw and what kind of condition he's in?
Well, the person, the aided, was in very good condition. The New York City Emergency Service medic and the doctor kept him in great shape all through the night with medications and keeping his IV, giving him IV and keeping his vitals in good condition.
How did you find him? What kind of an area was he in?
It was just a long confined area. There were pipes and concrete all around him, and from what I understand, originally he was buried up to his chest area, and New York City Emergency, New York City Fire Department.
Some great news. 6 firemen pulled out alive. We want to keep you updated on traffic and weather. Let's check in with Monica Woods.
Live outside right now, we do have mostly clear skies to get the day started. Here is here's the look at what's going on right now outside. We do have temperatures that are in the 50s this morning, and we'll take a live look hopefully outside at our tower cam. Right now we have white up on the tower because we are expecting some clouds to move into the forecast. Currently we have a temperature of 58 for Sacramento, Stockton 61, as well as Modesto, Lake Tahoe at 43. Look at what we're expecting for today, and that is partly cloudy skies for the forecast. Our high today 84 degrees, sunrise at 6:45. Quick look at our 5-day forecast, and temperatures will stay fairly cool for tomorrow, 88 degrees, but then slightly warmer for the end of the work week and into the weekend. Let's get a check on our morning commute now. Beth Duncan has the latest.
Thanks, Monica. Checking our local freeways, we're looking pretty good all the way around. Let's take a look at the maps. If you are coming in on 50, 80, 99, or 5, everything is moving smoothly at the moment. The Folsom Dam Road is closed until further notice for precautionary reasons. Again, Folsom Dam Road remains closed today. You will not be able to use that. If you are headed to the Bay Area this morning, BART has resumed action, so you certainly can go to your BART destination and pick it up. Freeway-wise, we look good from Sacramento to the Bay Area right now with no major incidents other than normal commute patterns, and I expect today that things might be a little bit lighter than usual as some folks make a decision to stay home. If you're headed west out of the Stockton, Modesto areas, everything looks good through the Tracy Triangle and headed over through Concord on Highway 4. Again, heightened security on all bridges in and around the Bay Area this morning. Outside Live, let's take a look at what's happening. Downtown arrivals very light right now. That's our Capital City Freeway portion, WX bordered by WNX. Otherwise, around town, we are also still in very good shape. That's a check of traffic. Back to you guys.
All right, thank you, Beth. We're going to keep you updated with weather and traffic every 10 minutes. In the meantime, let's return to ABC News.
That's an organization that's very stressed right now. In addition,
and depleted.
At the scene, they've called for crime scene investigators and 20 detectives to respond to Church and Day, which is on the back side of the World Trade Center, because they've recovered either bodies or evidence not far from where this rescue was made that the Nassau County people were just talking about. And developments in the operational end of the investigation, before we get to the substance of it, the FBI has left its New York office. They've split into 3 quadrants, one team operating out of a garage, another operating off of a naval ship in the harbor, another team operating out of some borrowed office space with the police department. Same with police headquarters, which at this time, when you'd really need command and control from there, they're operating off-site. All their phones are down, their air conditioning because of the condition of lower Manhattan and the problems with telephones from this explosion. So logistically, they're facing tremendous problems, although they seem to be getting through it. Recapping the investigative developments, in Venice, Florida, the FBI has conducted raids and executed a search warrant and are searching for a man named Mohammed Atta. This information, according to our investigative reporter Brian Ross, who's been speaking to federal officials in Washington. They say at a car rented in Boca Raton, they conducted a search and found pictures of Osama bin Laden. In Boston, FBI agents investigating the backgrounds of 5 men in a rented car found at Logan Airport, where some of these flights emanated from, including, we are told from our sources, flight instruction manuals in Arabic. Those 5 men believed to be those who were the hijackers and killed in the explosions. So they are picking up a trail now.
These 5 got to Boston starting in Canada, right?
It appears that they came to Boston from Maine, and the speculation or the information is Maine is, of course, the Canadian border, and that is a place that, as Brian Ross said earlier, is a soft border and one that they've had incursions through before that they've documented. So they believe they came from Canada.
So moves that we know of at least in 2 fronts, one in Venice, Florida, with this fellow Mohammed Atta, and the other in Boston, where even we understand they took seats out of the Logan Airport where these fellows may have sat, and to check, presumably, I guess, for any DNA that may be there.
And from the rent-a-car. And what's significant about them is, of the 5, 2 are brothers, and one is supposed to be a pilot. The inference there is that he could have trained the hijack team to fly.
Sure.
Let's get the news now from John McWethy, who's at the Pentagon. Haven't heard from you in a while. John, what's new there?
They are continuing to try to put out fires after all of this time, nearly 24 hours. There are still fires burning in the Pentagon. The lack of structural integrity in the damaged area has prevented the search and rescue people from being able to get in and look for any possible survivors. There's a makeshift morgue in the center courtyard of the Pentagon where they have laid out a lot of body bags, hundreds and hundreds of body bags that have not yet been filled, but that may be in anticipation of things yet to come. They are compiling a list of the missing, which may eventually become the list of the dead. They do not know. They're reluctant to talk about the numbers of all of the people that are missing. Operationally, they have taken an aircraft carrier that was heading home from the Persian Gulf and turned it around. They have canceled exercises in the Persian Gulf. All of that tells me that they are making their forces available should a military response be something that they want to think about in the hours and days ahead. Just a very busy scene, a very sad scene over at the Pentagon.
John, I know they've made a great point of saying the Pentagon will be open today for business. The president trying to emphasize that the city of Washington is operating, that they've not in any way, these terrorists, been able to curtail the activities of government. But a lot of people, we understand, have been told to stay home from the Pentagon today. I guess those particularly who work in that area.
Roughly half of the Pentagon workforce is not going to be able to get in their offices, Charlie. It is shut down because of damage and smoke, but some fraction of them will. The Secretary of Defense's office is operational. The National Military Command Center is definitely operational, and the area that the press has in the Pentagon will be open today. We anticipate there will be briefings from the regular Pentagon briefing room, all trying to give the appearance that they are open for business, and but it is certainly not going to be business as usual. Too many people lost too many friends. There is a pervading sense of anger among military officers that we talk to. They are not only sad, but really, really angry.
And John, any sense that they're expecting anything else anywhere in the world today?
There is no sense that the terrorist gun is still cocked and loaded, Diane, but obviously with the measures that they have taken, seizing the airspace around Washington and New York, using military aircraft to patrol the skies and to monitor all movement, gives you some sense of how nervous and how careful they feel they must be in the aftermath of this multiple attack.
All right, John McWethy at the Pentagon. Jack, thanks very much. We're going to go to Claire Shipman just across the river in Washington. Claire?
Well, Charlie, it's not really business as usual in larger Washington either. Of course, it's not quite the same tragic scenes that we have here that you have in New York, but this nation's capital is recovering from quite a shock. Estimates are that it could be several hundred or more dead from that attack on the Pentagon. The streets around the White House have been reopened, but large numbers of police remain. 30 to 50 members of the National Guard are patrolling. F-16 still flying overhead. We just saw one a few minutes ago. In the meantime, of course, the president is scheduled to meet with congressional leaders today, another show of unity and bipartisanship. You probably heard he's going to set up a blood drive at the White House. We're told that he's very
We're going to return to live coverage from ABC News in just a moment. First, we're going to do weather and traffic on the 10th. Let's check in with Monica Woods.
Well, we are expecting increasing clouds for today. Let's take a live look outside right now, and we are having mostly clear skies to get us started this morning, but white up on the tower because increasing clouds today. Marysville right now at 57 degrees, San Francisco 56, Fairfield 61, Lake Tahoe at 43, and in Sacramento it is 58 degrees. Satellite and radar across the state, well, you can see the clouds moving generally to the north and off to the east, that in association with our low pressure system that brought us a few sprinkles yesterday morning. On the big picture, there goes that low, and behind it, high pressure will build in, meaning clearer skies ahead for the extended forecast in through the weekend. A look at our 7-day forecast, and we are expecting highs today to be fairly similar to yesterday in the middle 80s, and then we'll be in the upper 80s for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, right around 90, upper 80s for Sunday. Let's get a check on that morning commute now. Beth Duncan has the latest from the traffic center.
Thanks, Monica. Locally, the commute looks pretty good. Let's take a check of the maps because a lot of folks head to the Bay Area this time of the morning. And right now, Stockton, Modesto, everything is rolling quite nicely on 99 and 5. We have no accidents to tell you about from Stockton to Tracy, Stockton to Modesto in the San Joaquin Valley area. If you are headed west, again, a reminder that we do have some very serious situations in San Francisco in terms of the bridges. They are just watching them very carefully. So you may see some extra security around bridges. But right now we have typical delays headed westbound on 580 through Pleasanton and on 4 over through Concord. We do have one accident in Benicia, south 680 after Lake Herman. A solo vehicle involved there, a tow truck en route. Sacramento, everything is moving quite well with no delays getting into the downtown area. The Folsom Dam Road will remain closed today for precautionary measures. Live outside, here's a quick look at what's happening. As folks head into the downtown, things are looking very good. That's 99 at Mac with traffic already building at that location. That's a check of traffic this morning. Dan and Alicia, back to you.
Thanks, Beth. 521, back to ABC's live coverage.
On TV, how did you find out?
Well, it was a long process. I was listening to the radio and I heard about the tower, but he always leaves on a Monday to Los Angeles. He works for Raytheon. He's an executive on Raytheon. He's been with them 25 years. And he's vice president, and they've given him an executive position, and he runs to California every Monday and comes back Friday night. This time when I heard that, and he always flies American Airlines, when I heard that the thing on the radio, I just didn't assume that this would be Tuesday until my son David, who's sitting here, came in the house and said, "I got something to tell you." And said Peter was on that plane that hit the airport, hit the tower.
David, how did you know? It's Charlie Gibson. How did you know?
Charlie, I was at my office and we were listening to the news as everybody was, and I knew because I had talked to my brother Monday, which is now, and he had stayed an extra day to do some paperwork and to catch up on some things locally and to do some work around the yard. So I knew he didn't leave on Monday. I didn't know that he always flew American, but I did know he left early in the morning from Boston. And once we realized that the plane had originated in Boston, we surmised that it might have been his. I called Raytheon, spoke to his secretary, and she confirmed that that was the flight that he was programmed to be on. And knowing my brother, if he was supposed to be on a plane, he was going to be there and be on it. That's the way he was.
William, tell me a little bit more about your bro.
He doesn't have a mic, so he
he doesn't. Oh, okay. No. I'm sorry. Well, you talk for him, David.
Okay. He was 54. He was an engineer, worked for Raytheon all his career, over 30 years. Had a family of 3 children and a wife. He was a very dedicated person. He was an energetic person. He was a precise person. I think most engineers are. Everything that he did precisely and correctly and very efficiently. He enjoyed sports. He enjoyed his family. We obviously are all going to miss him tremendously, but we share with the rest of the country and what's happened to the United States and to thousands and thousands of people, many of whom we still don't even know in those buildings in New York.
And Mr.
Well,
Gates?
I was listening to you while we were waiting to come on this program this morning, and when I hear that there were knives used and that they might have got the stewardess first, let me tell you, boy, Peter would have jumped out of that chair and went for that guy, I'm damn sure. And maybe he was knifed down also, because there was some story about someone calling on a cell phone saying that there was some stabbing going on. He was such an efficient man, such a good boy.
Mr. Gay and David and William, I think everybody admires so much your sense of valor and patriotism in a moment like this. And again, all we can say is our sadness and our gratitude to you for being with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just before you go, I'm curious, and we need to move on, but I am curious. I know your thoughts very personally of the family or of your son and your brother.
Right.
But there's an anger in this country that we've talked a lot about this morning, and I wonder if you feel, how you feel.
Yeah, I have it. I served in World War II. I'd tell you, if I was a young man today, I'd tell the president I'd be the first one to go over there. Somebody's got to pay for this.
Being a lawyer, I share in that sense, but I also would like to see them brought to justice if that's possible. If that's not possible and it can't be done in our justice system, then something, I agree with my father, something has to be done to stop this type of terrorism.
Well, you speak so nicely about your son and about your brother. And
well, I have 7 of them. I have 7. And no son should go before the father.
That is for sure. That is for sure. There is nothing more tragic than a parent burying a child. Peter Gay?
If we get a body, Charlie, I don't even know if we'll get a body.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's
okay.
true. David, William,
yes.
Peter, all the best to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as I say, they do speak very well of a son and a brother.
I'm sort of amazed at the ability of these families, not just to think of their own grief, but to be thinking about the country and I guess what they want to make sure that everybody still stands for in this country at the same time. It's hard to do.
John Miller is here again. I've been reporting on the investigation through the morning and all day yesterday as well. We've been talking about the fact that the FBI has a lead on 5 people who came from Canada into Portland, Maine, rented a car there, apparently went down to Boston, and may have been involved in the hijackings of the 2 planes that were taken out of Boston, the 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center towers. And you have some lead as to how the FBI got onto these fellas?
It was basic detective work. They were able to obtain very quickly the manifests from the airlines, go over the names, and then run names through their databases looking for any connections or intelligence links there. I don't know if they reached any. They were also able to match information from the flight attendant on one flight who gave the seat number of one of the hijackers, which gave them additional information on one individual, and then scan the airport parking lots for cars after checking with the rental companies to see if there was a vehicle attached to that, and they were able to zero in on this rent-a-car. This story was first reported in the Boston Herald, and we've been able to confirm parts of it through this morning.
Yes, and I know ABC's Brian Ross has been checking on this same story about how the FBI got onto to the 5 people, the 5 Arabs who were in Boston, and Brian is coming over here even as we speak.
And Brian's information, his first information this morning centered on a different end of this in Florida, where the FBI is searching for another man and executed additional warrants.
What did you learn?
Well, in Florida this morning, they went to the home based on the identification of a car and found that the Muhammad Adi did not live there, had never lived there.
In Florida?
In Florida, and owned by a man who lived there for 10 years, but who happens to be an employee at the local airport. So they're trying to figure out what the leads are on that. As well, in Boston, authorities are telling us this morning that they have now determined that it must have been a very significant cell of these 5 people in Boston who they have now traced through whatever they found in the car as having been at the airport again and again over the last few months, apparently casing it out, looking for security, looking for weaknesses, and that they had gone back and forth between Boston and Portland, Maine, and they're sending a large contingent of agents into Portland, Maine. But they consider this a serious cell that was operating there for some time. One of the leads on these men came because the 5 men got into dispute in the parking garage with someone who, when he saw the developments, called the state police and said, I think this may be a connection. And that led them apparently to the car in the parking garage.
In Boston?
In Boston.
So that dispute would have been yesterday?
That dispute would have been yesterday morning, some sort of fight over the parking space.
So in Florida, the person worked at the airport, and needless to say, we draw absolutely no conclusion of any kind
Not
from
at all.
that. From the beginning, we have wondered whether they went through security in a regular way, or whether they had some sort of special access, but nothing new from your end on that, John?
No, and from the type of weapons that passengers are describing them using, it's the kind of stuff that you really could get through airline security with very little effort.
It's 5:30. You're watching News 10 Good Morning. It's Wednesday, September 12th. I'm Dan Elliott.
And I'm Alicia Malaby. We're going to continue with our coverage of the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. in a moment. But first, we want to update you on the forecast. Here's Monica Woods.
Well, we're looking at clear skies to get us started this morning. Our out-the-door forecast does include some clouds, though, building throughout the day. Here's a live look outside at our weather.